official drop of our memoir, Incomparable, comes out Cinco de Mayo, 5/5, May 5th. This is just like so surreal. I can't believe our book is out.
I can't believe it.
It's taken 2.5 years for us to do with an incredible ghostwriter. But we are so excited to share even more of our story, even beyond the reality cameras, to take you in a deeper look into our life. And I'm nervous. Are you nervous? But I'm excited because Brie and I made our memoir not just to be about our story, but to truly inspire and motivate and help all of you to be the hero of your own story.
Exactly. And, you know, we're excited because there's a lot of stories that you guys haven't heard of us. And we're really excited that you can finally see like what really defined us as strong women.
So on all of our social platforms, we have links in like our bios and stuff where you can get your very own book, Incomparable. So if you haven't already pre-ordered or ordered yours, make sure to head to our links and get your very own copy of Incomparable. And when we are through this whole pandemic of COVID-19, we will be setting up a book tour, and we will make sure that we can try and sign all of your copies.
Hey, we are here. It's the Turnbuckle King here. We are talking about Incomparable, book that's written by Nikki and Brie Bella. You guys get your likes as you come into the ring. And Pink Square Circle will be a dual simulcast. We're here at Red Carpet Ring and we're here at the Pink Square Circle. We're here talking about the audiobook of the twins, the Nikki Bella and Brie Bella. These are the legendary twins that's been WWE for many, many years. You know them. They have done the twin magic. They've won championships, and they now are mothers, and they also are WWE Hall of Famers. So these two decided to write a book, Incomparable. It's about 6 hours worth of content of the book of Nikki and Brie Bella. Throughout the book, you're going to hear stories of both sides. You'll hear Brie on some sides, and you'll hear Nikki on some sides. So it'll be a good audiobook. Now, this audiobook came out a while back. This book actually came out, I want to say back in, came out 2020, no, actually came out right before pandemic, like they said in the preview. Came out a while back. I want to say it came out in 2020. So it's about 4 years old now. But we're going to talk about it. Enough for me. We're talking about this book here, guys. We are going to go through the first 3 hours, and then they'll be split in 2 parts. So this is part 1, and then we'll get to the other parts later. With that being said, guys, get the likes as you come in, and make sure you double tap that screen. And let me give you guys some reminder before we begin.
Not real.
Trust me.
But that doesn't do anything, man.
All right, let's get in. Let's start this audiobook, and thank you all for coming out. Let's check out Incomparable by Nikki and Brie Bella, and of course narrated by others as well. So you'll hear a mixture of people talking. But let's get into it, guys.
Simon & Schuster Audio presents Incomparable by Brie and Nikki Bella. Read by Jamie Matler and Elisa Flanagan. With an introduction read by the authors.
This book is dedicated to our family. Thank you for letting us share our story. And to our Bella Army. We wouldn't be where we are at today without you all. Introduction. Cutting the Promo. 2019. San Diego, California. Brie. In wrestling, cutting a promo is when you get on the mic and create your backstage storyline. Whether victim or heel, good guy or bad, beloved or betrayed, promos are the basis of every great in-ring rivalry, of every highly tuned moment of drama on the mat. It's your chance to make the audience care so that when you step out onto that ramp, you're met with boos or cheers, both equally good as far as ratings go. Promos are, for the most part, pure fabrication, a device of writers and producers who know how to craft compelling characters who know how to make good TV. Because we are twins, they didn't have to use a lot of imagination when they launched us on the main roster. We are identical, so their strategy was to treat us like the same person. They made it about our twindom, not us individually. They made us dress identically, wear our hair identically, move in the ring identically, achieve an identical body composition. This is common in twin culture. In the baby and toddler years, you see it as identical dressing, almost as an inability to treat twins differently, to introduce any individuality at all. It's a version of treating everyone the same until they have a chance to express who they are on their own. When you get older, the cracks in the twindom begin to show. You enter the age of comparison, which lasts your whole life. Which one of you is skinnier? Which is smarter? Which is better at soccer? Knowing the comparison is coming, that your benchmark is the woman who shared the womb with you, who is sitting next to you, means that you learned how to compete often and easily. We accepted that it was a hallmark of life. The problem is that the very act of comparison typically requires that someone be better. Someone needs to win.
Nicole, in many ways, being a twin is like competing against yourself. It's this weird ground where you want to distinguish yourself. You want to win, but it is entwined with love. You don't want the fact that you have won to mean that the person you love the most has lost. I beat my sister at soccer, but only because she was so much better at ballet. She was a better artist. I was better at drama. When you're an identical twin, you start to see your potential as a million possibilities. You see in your twin a different outcome from the same egg, not for better or for worse. It was easy to then project how we were onto the other girls, to understand that we all have gifts, that some of our qualities can be overexpressed or not expressed at all, that the worst thing we can do is shut each other down. It became apparent to both of us that it was all about trade-offs. It was about not having or being everything at the same time, and that the gifts of others are not threats. We came to the understanding that there will always be plenty of beer at the party for everyone. We live in a world of abundance. We just have to choose to see it that way. Your nice house doesn't mean I can't have a nice house too. The fact that someone else gets something that you want doesn't mean that you won't get it at a different time, or that something equally wonderful won't come along that you might want more. As women, we too often feel threatened by other women. We should celebrate what they achieve as a testament of what we can achieve too. Comparison of and between women is rampant in our culture. And with that comes this idea and fear of scarcity, that there isn't enough opportunity to go around. And historically, there certainly hasn't been. We witnessed it firsthand in WWE, where the men far outnumbered the women on the roster. But we also see that this reality is shifting, as we, along with the other divas turned superstars, have brought more awareness to women's wrestling through our TV shows, through cutting great promos, and through pure athletic aerobics and sport. We have brought more young girls and women into the audience. They want to see more of us, and the makeup of the roster is beginning to shift in response. Wrestling is different from other sports in that it is a competition, yes, but it is also a collaboration. We rely on each other to pull off our matches. We rely on each other to make the spectacle look good, to put on a great show. In many ways, we are the perfect illustration of how women helping women only creates more opportunities for all of us, not the other way around. We watched as multiple women experienced success at the very same time. This is not a strange concept to men, but it is certainly not standard thinking for women across the board. We often work at places where there might only be one female executive at a company. We hope that we're a part of a cultural movement that helps to change that, where young girls grow up believing that they can do anything,
without also having to believe that they're going to have to break down walls to do it. Brie, being part of this movement is a great privilege and a great responsibility. And that's one of the reasons that Nicole and I felt like it was so important to tell our whole story from the beginning. It has had incredible bright spots. We both have comfortable lives and incredible careers in the WWE that are hopefully not close to being over yet. I have an amazing husband, Brian, and my daughter, Birdie. And if I'm lucky, I'll have another kid. I have every confidence that Nicole is going to be a mother down the road, too. Obviously, we wrote this a while ago, but we could save our pregnancy stories for the sequel. But it has not been easy to get here. Ours is certainly not the worst story you'll ever read in terms of adversity. There are people who have risen from far more terrible circumstances. But it was very rough at times and punctuated with loss and pain, which forced us to a point of real strength. After all, something has to shine the diamond. Nicole. The tendency to play the victim card is strong in our culture, particularly for women. I absolutely understand why. I think it goes back to feeling compared. A shitty childhood or bad circumstances along the way is one way to distinguish yourself or justify why what might have been never came to be. I get it. The pull to go there is so strong because it's a built-in excuse, and it can also seem like a reason. I feel very fortunate that my life didn't go to a dark place, that Brie and I found the inner strength to fight against a dimmer destiny. We are strong, yes, but I also credit my grandfather, Pop-Pop, for making sure that it didn't happen. I think he knew that Brie and I were right on the line of a different sort of life, and he stepped in as much as he could. He made us realize that our futures could be brighter than a childhood of abuse might suggest. And so, at a young age, Brie and I decided we did not want to be victims. Instead, we wanted to be survivors, the heroes of our own stories, to take control and responsibility for our lives. It's a fine line and hard to do, acknowledging that you have been a victim, that you have been wronged, but at the same time, not letting the victimhood continue to take your life hostage. Otherwise, the original crimes and original hurts just end up taking your entire life away. And we thought we had already given up enough. Everyone has sad stories and happy stories. Unfortunately, pain is a permanent part of life, no matter how much money or privilege or opportunity you might have. You can't escape pain. It's the darkness contrasting all that is wonderful and bright. It's what gives life texture. So we made an unconscious decision when we were younger to process the pain as best as we are able, and then to spend the rest of our lives showing the world how strong we truly are. I think we are able to do this, in part, because we were able to draw strength and resiliency from each other, because we weren't necessarily feeling low at the exact same times. It's like those couples who say that they never got divorced because they never wanted to get divorced at the same time. We decided not to use our pain to justify falling behind. Instead, we decided to use our pain to make a difference, dragging each other forward. Brie. It was hard not to be envious of the kids who had it easier growing up, who had more stable parents, whose homes weren't broken. But hardship has its upsides too. In some ways, it's a great and motivating opportunity. It gives you something to press off as you hunt for something different. It makes it easy to determine exactly what you don't want to recreate. We knew we wanted something better, and we knew if that was going to happen, it was within our power to make it so. The following pages are not promo cutting, they are reality. And while some of the storylines in the ring have not been true, this overall through line is: we are the heroes of our own story, and our story is our own to make. While we experienced some of our stories together, a lot of it happened to us individually, and we had to go at it alone. Even though we are identical twins, our stories are incomparable, and your story will be incomparable too.
Chapter 1. Twin Magic. 2002 to 2008. San Diego, California, Los Angeles, California, McDonough, Georgia, Tampa, Florida. Nicole. I made my SmackDown debut on August 29th, 2008, sitting in the dark, under the ring. I had snuck in during a commercial break when all audience eyes were trained on suspended screens up high. I wore a black hooded sweatshirt pulled tight over my face. I walked into the arena in the darkness, with the WWE stage managers who were transitioning the ring to the next match. Nobody noticed when I rolled below. There was a monitor down there, so I could watch as my identical twin sister Brie walked the ramp to the ring. We had used all our own money, and we didn't really have any at that time, to make wrestling gear for our debut. The outfits were fine. Red, basic, totally PG and unthreatening. But the veterans, in a classic hazing move, wouldn't let us wear them, because red was another wrestler's color. It sounds weird because WWE is such a big production. You'd think they'd orchestrate every moment and choreograph the backstage, too. But in many ways, they run it like a mom-and-pop operation and let wrestlers work it out themselves. At that time in particular, the veterans had all the power in the locker room. Those sorts of mind games were just part of the backstage experience, especially for the women. There was really nothing we could do but bite our lips and then hustle to come up with something else. You make and pay for your own gear in WWE, with no oversight or input from management. There's no costume closet or official wardrobe department. So we dug through our gym bags to find something that would work, which is how we ended up in black workout pants we had worn to the gym earlier that day, spray painted with glitter at the hems, and silver tankinis. The seamstresses helped us cut up some bathing suits we found in our luggage and then stitch them to our pants. Not exactly the first impression we were hoping to make, but the only thing we could come up with in a few short and panicked hours in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We changed in the arena bathroom because the veterans wouldn't let us change in the locker room. We were the semi-main event, which means we were right before the main show. The appetizer. Brie was wrestling Victoria, a talented longtime WWE veteran and former women's champion. She was known for her red hair and a widow's peak finishing move that was a neckbreaker. Essentially, she would hoist you up back to back before dropping to her knees. It hurts. As the two went after each other, Brie held her down with some old-school snaps and a flying snap mare before Victoria started screaming, "Welcome to SmackDown, Brie, and not tonight, sweetheart." She was in Brie's face and dominating her with a lot of hair pulling and a standing moonsault, essentially a backflip into a body slam. Below deck in the dark, I adjusted my costume, hair, and makeup to match Brie as she became more and more disheveled and out of breath. 90 seconds in, a panting Brie crawled in to join me while the crowd screamed, "Get back in the ring! Get back in the ring!" And then, in our first ever twin magic maneuver, Victoria grabbed me by the legs and pulled me out, tossing me back up. I pretended to be exhausted as she grabbed me by the hair, and then I flipped her over and pinned her for a 3 count. So, while Brie was the first to walk down the SmackDown ramp, I was the first to win a SmackDown match. I cemented my victory with a really cringy dance where I jumped up and down like an overexcited contestant on The Price is Right, rocked my hips back and forth, and flipped my hair. The bump and grind wouldn't be perfected for a few years.
Brie. When my entrance music hit, a classic called Feel Your Body from the WWE Music Vault, I thought I might vomit. I was so scared my vision went blurry. The arena probably had close to 1,700 people in it, which is staggering when you're used to wrestling in church parking lots and JCCs for a few dozen diehard fans. I didn't have a vignette or anything because I had never been on TV before. So they announced my name and I walked out to silence. They probably assumed I was a local because WWE will do that occasionally. The locals they tap are actually indie wrestlers, so they're experienced in the ring and won't hurt themselves, but they'll let them have a match where they typically get destroyed. Randomly, Freddie Prinze Jr. was the writer who was working with me at WWE, and he was a fount of positivity. He was so encouraging and just kept telling me, "You got this," on repeat, until I could say it back to him. In his non-acting life, Freddie is a crazy wrestling fan. Working with him in our debut just made the whole thing even more surreal. Fortunately, my adrenaline took over and put me on some sort of autopilot, kind of like what I would guess an out-of-body experience would feel like. I walked down the ramp and rolled into the ring. I don't remember much of that first match, except that Victoria was awesome to work with. I felt terrible that she had to put me over and let me win, because that sucks for a veteran, but she told me not to worry. Throughout the match, she really helped me out and kept talking into my ear about what to do next. Slow down. Not yet. I'll tell you when. And recounting it, it sounds an awful lot like sex. We were some of the first women ever to debut on the main stage as wrestlers, rather than as valets, managers, or love interests for the men. This was one of the reasons that the neck hairs of the other women in the locker room were up. The only downside of skipping straight to the fighting, and I'm not complaining here, is that when you valet, which is essentially escorting wrestlers to the mat and then working up the crowd by taunting the rival valets, you have time to get a storyline going that the crowds care about. You can draw attention and interest in a no-pressure way. You are just icing on the cake, circling the ring. Because we got to skip those steps, and in the process might be helping to set a new precedent for the women coming up behind us, we felt a lot of extra pressure to do well out there. The audience reaction was pretty great, considering we were total newcomers, and my identity as an identical twin was a secret. We wouldn't be outed for several months after Victoria grew suspicious in a promo backstage when I asked the seamstresses to make me 2 dresses, just in case. You want the crowd to clap, or you even want them to boo. Boredom is the worst fate of any wrestler. The minute they lose interest and start checking their text messages or decide it's a good time to go to the bathroom, you're done. Because women's matches are so much shorter than the men's, typically only 2 minutes during TV events, you don't have time to get their attention again to show them what you can do. So my intent was pretty simple. I wanted to be memorable, to pique the crowd's interest, and to show them that despite the fact that I was a small girl, I could still fight. While we had the luxury of making our debut before social media was a part of daily life, and the trolling that often comes with it, we did get indications that the fans were into us. We trended #1 on Yahoo for 2 days straight after our debut, which was the biggest barometer of popularity at the time. So we stayed on the main roster and weren't sent back down to FCW, WWE's developmental promotion at the time. Our debut was good enough that it made a lot of trouble for us with the other girls backstage. It was rough, like the worst kind of sorority, but we got it. You have to be able to earn your stripes as a wrestler, to know what's worth fighting about. We learned that you don't get to change in the locker room your first day out, or your 50th. There are ever-changing rules about what you can wear and what moves you can do. Essentially, anything perceived as someone else's signature is off limits. It was cutthroat, and they hated us. There was a lot of bullshit, but we had decided to stick, and so we did exactly that, with smiles on our faces. When they realized that we weren't going anywhere, they started to leave us alone. More on all of that later. After our match, we celebrated in Gorilla, the area between backstage and the ramp where you wait before you go out, with Victoria, Freddie, and Vince McMahon. It was a great moment, and everyone was really happy for us. Then we booked it to the Hyatt across the street for celebratory drinks. Because, hot damn, Nicole and I had just made our debut on WWE TV.
Nicole. I got a boob job in 2012. What can I say? I had always wanted big boobies, particularly since mine just disappeared after I started to get really fit for wrestling. It took me a long time to make the $6,500 to pay for them. I have never messed with my face. Intentionally, that is. In 2008, weeks before our main stage debut, when we were still down in Florida at FCW, I was with another wrestler looking at a magazine that we had all been featured in. He was sitting up on the apron when another guy, whose stage name was Sweet Daddy Sanchez, hit the ropes. It ricocheted back and hit this guy, Jack Swagger, whose massive face collided with mine. He sent me flying. I literally caught air and flew several feet, and my nose just busted open. It was like being headbutted by The Rock. Natty Neidhart, Natalia, who was wrestling down in Florida with us at the time, rushed me to the locker room. I didn't want to tell anyone because it was hours before a match,
So I mopped up the blood, iced my nose, and slathered on about 2 inches of foundation. I wrestled that night and then went to the trainer, who told me that not only had I shattered my nose, but I had suffered a mild concussion as well. Brie was with Craig, her boyfriend at the time, back in Los Angeles. And so another wrestler named Nick was nice enough to keep me awake all night. Not like that, you pervs. The next morning, I looked like a dinosaur. You couldn't see the bridge of my nose or even my eyes. And I have a black eye on the right side to this day from stuck blood, which no doctor or dermatologist or acupuncturist has been able to fix. When we were brought up to the main roster a few weeks later, they decided to minimize my time in the ring, i.e. my face in front of an HD video camera, until my face had more time to heal. The thing about being an identical twin is that you're supposed to look identical.
Brie. Speaking of boob jobs, I will never get one. Though it had been one of the first questions from WWE when we showed up at Diva Search at the Ritz-Carlton in Marina del Rey about a year and a half earlier. Are you open to a boob job? We flipped out and started to tell them off, escalating to about a 10 in just a few seconds in true Bella fashion. We had shown up that morning with a lot of excitement and definitely ready to wrestle. As soccer players, Nicole was toying with the idea of moving to Italy to play professionally before I dragged her to the audition. The idea of sports entertainment seemed made for us. We made tank tops, Breezy Fashizi and Nicole Fashow, and put on bandanas and sneakers in anticipation of getting to fight. We weren't worried that neither of us had ever actually been in a ring. What we found instead was a long line of girls dressed like go-go dancers. The girl in front of us, Layla, was beautiful. She was also dressed like an athlete, and so the three of us marveled at the spectacle around us, confused and a little concerned. While she ended up going on to win Diva Search, she did not need a boob job. We didn't make it to the final 8. But Kristen Prouty, who worked in talent for WWE, convinced them to send us to a developmental wrestling facility in McDonough, Georgia, called Deep South. I guess she thought we had what it would take to fight in that ring and win.
Nicole. Now, before everyone gets up in arms about the Diva Search go-go dancing casting call comment, Brie and I were Hooters girls. And once you are a Hooters girl, you are always a Hooters girl. And as a woman, I firmly believe it is every woman's prerogative to use what God gave her and screw the haters. Not literally. I think we found the audition outfits troubling and the boob job comment offensive because we thought we were there as athletes. Sexy athletes, sure, but not just there to be ringside eye candy. After all, we had seen the WWE's Attitude Era, a time in the late 1990s to early 2000s when women were expected to fight in bras and thongs and pull each other's hair and then make out in the ring. That time was supposed to be over, replaced by a more family-friendly WWE, where women were allowed to actually wrestle. Our brother JJ, who was 2 years younger, loved the Attitude Era. He watched wrestling all the time when he was a kid. He was particularly obsessed with The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin. He would follow us around and try to take us down with his finisher, which he called the Priest. It was a gimmick where he would make the sign of the cross and then give us the holy elbow, which involved him dropping his arm on our heads. He was in the 4th or 5th grade and he was a little shit, so it was pretty annoying. Brie and I hadn't thought about wrestling much beyond evading JJ until we landed jobs at a California Hooters when we were 18.
Brie. After high school, we both needed to get out of Arizona for different reasons that we'll get into in a bit. So we enrolled in Grossmont Community College in San Diego. We had been born there, and we had family nearby. Our grandparents stretched to pay for our housing, at the Conch no less. It was a famous party dorm on the San Diego State University campus where my mom had gotten drunk a lot when she was young. "Oh, great. That's where they're putting you?" was her response when we shared the good news. And despite our parents' divorce a few years earlier, our mom scraped together enough money to cover our first semester tuition. But we needed cash to pay for food and books. And when you're in college, nothing brings in the dollar bills like waitressing. It's actually hard to get a waitressing job when you're underage because you can't serve hard alcohol. The only place that was hiring 18-year-olds was Hooters, since they're wine and beer only. The Mission Valley Outpost was actually the highest performing franchise in the world, probably because it was right after 9/11 and we were at war. All the military guys from Camp Pendleton came hungry and often, and they were amazing tippers. God bless the military. They definitely paid for a lot of our textbooks, and if we're honest, beers at Bennigan's after our shifts, trips to Tijuana, and Ho Heels. Because they didn't have much to spend their money on, they would come in straight off the ship and leave a $20 tip on a $30 to $50 tab. With a menu of cheap beer and chicken wings, it's hard to get the tab north of that. And they would never skip out on the bill. A note on waitressing: not only does your waitress have to pay your bill if you skip, but the government assumes a 20% tip take-home. So if you leave less than that, she has to pay taxes on money she didn't actually make. So no, you're not actually giving a middle finger to the establishment. You're just screwing over someone who is probably living paycheck to paycheck.
Nicole. Working at Hooters was the best. Many of our closest friends to this day were made there. The pantyhose we had to wear are still our ride or die go-to in the WWE. They hold everything in. And we were invited to all the best parties. And unexpectedly, we always felt protected. It's funny because when we went in for our Hooters interviews, we wore multiple bras. Pre-boob job, remember? Thinking that being flat-chested would be a deal breaker. But it wasn't really like that. Plus, we had the whole twin thing going. My first night on the job, some jerk slapped my ass so hard he left a red rooster on my butt cheek. I assumed that was just the sort of thing that happened at Hooters. I told a fellow waitress about it under my breath. "He did what?" she asked, followed by a quick, "Where is he?" In under a minute, the manager and one of the line cooks had kicked him out and called the cops. A few years later, when I was a Hooters veteran and tolerated no bullshit, a bunch of Raiders football players came in to eat before playing against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the Super Bowl. They were rowdy, and one of the players grabbed me by the hair, bent me over, and pretended to do me doggy style. I flipped out and kicked them all out. Super Bowl be damned. You had to be a strong type of girl to work there. If it wasn't contending with ass slappers and boob grabbers, then it was dealing with people who judged your value system for putting on the tank top and serving beer in the first place. But I have never played the victim or the martyr, and I have certainly never felt compelled to ask permission to do what I want. Brie and I both learned at a young age how to take care of ourselves, and we both knew how to work the system to make some bank. I felt empowered, like I could conquer the world, and I dared any man to fuck with me without getting a fist to the face.
Brie. As a Hooters waitress, there was one drawback, and those were the monthly pay-per-view WWE weekend matches. The guys would post up for 3 hours and nurse a soda and some cheese fries while they watched wrestling. Tying up a table like that without ordering a banquet is a bummer for a waitress, unless you're going to compensate with a massive tip. They didn't. The WWE fans at the time were intense. One guy even brought his collection of troll dolls. He would arrange them in a semicircle across a foretop and blow on them for good luck. It was still the Attitude Era, and the show was essentially rated R. You didn't get the young girl fans then, and as a woman, it was hard to watch even though you could tell the ladies actually knew how to wrestle. Now the young girls look at us like we're Wonder Woman. But back then, the female wrestlers weren't allowed to be heroes. It was more spectacle than sport. It made me angry that they didn't give the women the same opportunities as the men.
Nicole. Back then, our heroes were Carla Overbeck, Brandi Chastain, and Mia Hamm, who had gone to the Olympics for soccer. I'll never forget that Mia Hamm Michael Jordan Gatorade commercial, where they faced off in different sports. Anything you can do, I can do better. Mia Hamm was better than any man. That was my belief system. I felt like that reality was within my grasp. It was hard to leave Hooters, to be honest. The money was really good, and we worked with all of our closest friends. They even give you benefits after you've been there for 2 years. And because we were all considered entertainers, they paid $8 an hour instead of typical waitressing hourly pay. But Brie started working with an LA-based modeling agency and was getting called to the city more and more. 2 of our Hooters friends wanted to come with us. and so we packed the car and drove north to Los Angeles to a cramped 2-bedroom on La Cienega and Olympic. At that point, we had done a few things. We were the first World Cup twins to tour with Budweiser in California. We were promotional models at conventions. Brie was a fitting model for DC shoes. No massive breaks, but enough affirmation that we could make some extra money while we figured out what we wanted to do with our lives.
Brie. What we definitely wanted to do with our lives was have fun. We lived in a dump, but we all had the best time, except for Nicole, who was still involved with and secretly married to her high school boyfriend. The rest of us were all dating athletes, actors, people who had names, and the club scene in Los Angeles was on fire. I don't know if it's because it was before social media, but there was a freedom and lack of self-consciousness that was just so liberating. We would go and dance and beg for free drinks from the bartenders. Bartenders will always be our weakness, until the clubs closed. Sunset would be a parking lot as we'd slowly crawl west for a late-night feast at Mel's Diner. I saw drugs for the first time at some of those parties, but I was never interested in that. My dad has struggled with addiction, particularly when we were kids, and so I had absolutely no curiosity. Beyond smoking the occasional joint with a group of friends and a short stint in high school as a chain cigarette smoker, I was really just a beer girl. While I've grown up to be a wine snob, at the time, if you gave me a Bud Light, I was thrilled. I think that's one of the reasons people loved our group. We were just happy-go-lucky Cali girls. While our extended Hooters gang all came from broken homes and pretty unhappy childhoods, we were enjoying our liberation and excited for the next chapter. Because of that, or in spite of that, we were all relaxed and low-key. We also liked to eat, which was shocking to the guys who hung out with us. I'll never forget when one of our friends ordered the meat platter, which was essentially a side of cow. The guy she was with couldn't get over that she had not only ordered it, but intended to finish it, all by herself. "That's just for you," he kept repeating. Meanwhile, we thought she had made a great dietary choice since it didn't have any carbs.
Nicole. We thought we should get real jobs while we auditioned, and so our friend Jamie, who was working as an assistant for the owner of an independent music label, hooked us up with A&R jobs. While the idea of listening to music for a living sounded cool in theory, we had no idea what we were doing. We would just eat our Baja Fresh burritos for lunch and put on our headphones. One day, the owner told us that Suge Knight was going to come by and that he might shoot up the joint. We knew it was a lie, but it was a weird enough one that we got in our car and decided to never come back. We had 99 problems already and didn't need Suge Knight to be one of them. Though it was hard to imagine that he gave a shit about this particular independent music label. I started working for Metal Storm Entertainment, who produced all of the Quicksilver films. I was driving down to Oceanside every day from LA, a commute that got really old fast. So I ditched my sister and moved back to San Diego for my next chapter.
Brie. After Nikki left, I decided to go back to the career I knew best. I landed a job as a waitress at Sushiya, a popular Japanese joint on Sunset. A lot of celebrities and Hollywood types would come in, which is how I met Craig. He was the guitarist for a rock band, who I went on to date for 5.5 years. More on that later. I also met Jay Bernstein, a producer and manager, Farrah Fawcett, Sammy Davis Jr., Suzanne Summers, Michael Landon, who told me there was something special about me. Now, when you're a waitress in Los Angeles, you hear this sort of thing so often it triggers an immediate eye roll. But he convinced me to take a scholarship to Ivan Markota's acting school. I figured, fuck it. I'm here in LA, why not? It was actually an amazing experience because it was my first formal introduction to acting. It made me both ask and answer the question of whether becoming an actress was something I actually wanted. The answer was no. At first, the classes were interesting, but very quickly it came to feel like I didn't have the freedom to create in there. I was being told exactly how it needed to be done, and that didn't capture my imagination. It felt boring. I called Jay and apologized. I told him that I simply didn't want to follow a script. Acting in that way wasn't for me. I was hanging out with Craig in the LA music scene. It was an incredible experience and reawakening for me. I've always been really drawn to the arts, music, painting, and poetry, but it wasn't something my parents prioritized. I craved the exposure. Art was also something that defined my high school boyfriend, Bear. In my eyes, artists were gods. In LA with Craig, I went to poker nights at Jerry Cantrell's house, for Christ's sakes. Alice in Chains was one of the soundtracks to high school for me. I got to travel to Europe for the first time when Craig was touring through Spain. He was a much bigger star internationally, and it was incredible to watch him move an arena through music. I was blown away by his power to transfix the crowd just through his ability to perform. I wanted to be able to do that too. I was also blown away by the groupies, who were completely enthralled with him. Their fanaticism for my boyfriend freaked me out. While Sushia was good to me, I needed to make more money. I got a cocktailing job at the Mondrian, a particularly seedy hotel at the time on Sunset. You could work 1 or 2 nights a week and still make your rent. I've always been one of those people who needs a cushion, which I certainly wasn't going to get from my parents. While Nicole is content to fly by the seat of her pants, she was known at the time for only having $10 in her bank account when rent was due. I'm a saver. I always prefer to live well within my means, and when you're a waitress, your means aren't high. I wanted the cushion in part so that I could travel with Craig when he toured. It was the first opportunity I had ever had to see the world. I've never been obsessed with owning nice things, but I wanted experiences.
Nicole. While Brie fell deeper in love with Craig, I was in a relationship black hole with a pro snowboarder. It was a period of extreme jealousy and codependence, and I was spending a lot of time with him in Salt Lake City, where he lived near his ex-wife and kids. We traveled a lot for his snowboarding, and our existence in general revolved around him and his career. This was much to the dismay of Brie, who felt like I was putting everything on hold for a guy who was very controlling. Sometimes when you're in it, it's hard to see it. My boyfriend agreed to spend some time with me in San Diego, and so I moved back to finish community college. I walked onto the soccer team, leading the girls to a state championship, and landed myself MVP in California. My coach at the time thought I was very marketable and urged me to move to Italy to try to make it as a professional player. That sounded like a great idea, if I could figure out how to make it work with my guy. But then Brie's agent called her about the WWE Divas search, and we decided to take another look at women's wrestling.
Brie. There was no way that we weren't going to do the wrestling training program at Deep South. Back then, there were 2 territories for wrestlers in developmental who had come up from the independents: Deep South Wrestling in McDonough, Georgia, DSW, and Ohio Valley Wrestling in Louisville, Kentucky, OVW. Brock Lesnar, Dave Bautista, and many others all came up through OVW. The Deep South session was 3 days long, though it felt like a week. It was a valid shot at getting put into a developmental, as WWE scouted the talent down there, looking for girls who could fight. It was very glow in that nobody knew what they were doing. The key difference was that we weren't all in it together. We were competing to get out of there as fast as possible. There were girls who were essentially stuck in Georgia, and they were pissed about it. They didn't really have a shot at making it into developmental, but the coaches and trainers kept them around. They needed them to wrestle and train up the newcomers. They seemed to know this and were pissed about it, but weren't willing to accept it and give up. Needless to say, they gave us a hard time. When we walked in, I remember one girl turning to her friend and saying, "Really? They don't look like models." To be fair, at 5'6", I don't think we look like supermodels either. But at the time, WWE was scouting models and trying to turn them into wrestlers. Some of the women down there definitely refused to teach us how to take bumps, instead giving us advice that almost guaranteed we'd get hurt. But that was just part of the drill, and we got it. In fact, we relished it. They had told us to spend the time watching, but we insisted on getting into the ring the first day. We wanted to be sure we'd like it as much as we thought.
Nicole. It was pretty brutal, but it was also love at first bump for us. We just knew that we were meant to do this, so the bullshit from the other girls didn't really bother us. We had big smiles and lots of energy, which probably only added fuel to the fire. But that's how we operated. Heads up, eyes on the prize, plenty of beer at the party for everyone. It always felt easier to show no resistance and let the girls talk shit and walk all over us than to fight the locker room fights. We saved our energy for the ring. And we had each other, which was huge. When the girls at Deep South wouldn't teach us much, we just tried to teach each other based on what we saw in the ring. The thing about wrestling is that when you don't know what you're doing, it hurts. Those hits and falls are real. And when you haven't been trained to lessen the blow, shield your body, or fake contact, you feel it everywhere. That first night in Georgia, we broke the motel room's TV and a console drawer practicing our holds. We made it look kind of right and hoped nobody would notice. The second night, we spread ice across the bed and just lay down on it. We were so sore we couldn't move. We learned a lot in those 3 days about how things work. There's really no rhyme or reason to who gets signed or who doesn't. You have to just let it ride. We also learned about how you need to operate outside the ring. One of the guys down there wanted to talk about the show and work us into a gimmick, and he stopped by our hotel room one night to talk it through. So naive. We didn't foresee that everyone couldn't stop talking about the fact that a guy was in our room, convinced that we had staged some sort of kinky threesome. We also had our first taste of kayfabe, which in wrestling is maintaining your in-ring persona outside of the ring, whenever wrestling fans are around. Before social media, WWE was all about kayfabe. If you were a babyface in the ring, you were a babyface outside the ring. If you were a heel, you would act like a heel in public. We went to a cafe with some of the girls down in Deep South, and we were all in line to order food when some fans approached. 2 girls had a match that weekend. They said kayfabe under their breath, separated, and started to give each other dirty looks. It was bizarre at times, but it was so fun. The goal at Deep South was to get a contract. There were WWE scouts on the ground, and trainers were filming with handheld camcorders, looking for talent who could move well and who might be able to hold main stage attention. At the end of our 3-day trial, they told us they were interested in having us come back and train for real. Side note, the restaurant we all ate at for the last night's celebration was Hooters, proving that all roads do lead home.
Brie. We went back up to San Diego to talk to our family about what we were thinking, particularly our grandfather, Pop Pop, who was the primary father figure in our lives. When we told him we wanted to become pro wrestlers and needed his blessing, he objected passionately. He wanted us to get married to nice guys and have babies, which was certainly a more assured future. He wanted to know we would be safe, tended to, protected. He always gave us good advice, and his voice was one of the only ones that actually mattered to us. So we talked a lot about how to convince him that this wouldn't be a waste of time. His knowledge of WWE was also limited to the Attitude Era, and so we understood why he wouldn't want his precious granddaughters doing bra and panty matches. If he had been alive to see us flourish, he would have loved it. And he would have laughed so hard. Our grandfather passed away shortly after, on November 28th, which was devastating for our entire family. We told WWE we needed time to be with our family. In that time off, they decided to shut down Deep South and began opening a new program in Tampa called FCW. They were investing in a new facility and building out a program. They offered us $500 a week, and we took it gladly. When the program opened, we moved to Florida. Craig and I had been together for 2 years, and we both thought we would be together forever. He was both hurt and shocked when I told him I was taking a job as a professional wrestler and moving to Florida. I felt like there was no way forward except through Tampa. If I didn't give wrestling a valid shot, I would always regret it. And so he begrudgingly helped me pack and promised to come visit. I clicked with him, but it seems I had clicked with wrestling even more. It was the first thing that I had felt passionate about in a long time, and I needed to see it through. Our relationship wasn't dramatic, and we'd endured distance before, so I felt like I could put it on ice while I went on this epic adventure.
Nicole. My boyfriend was less understanding than Craig. and completely flipped out about the idea of me working around men who were dressed in little more than underwear. It was silly. I'm not a cheater, and I certainly know how to handle myself around guys, even those who are scantily clad. But he was consumed with jealousy. There was no way I was not going, though. In fact, the more someone tells me no, the more my response is screw you. Our relationship lasted only a few more short and horrible months. Brie and I wanted to make an adventure out of the drive, so we sold off one of our cars for cash and packed up the more reliable Malibu with all of our possessions. We plotted out a road trip. It took us through San Antonio to see our Aunt Tony and Uncle Tom, and a massive rainstorm that I thought might wash the car off the road. From there, we headed to Mobile, Alabama. We were tired and hungry, and so we went downtown for burgers and beer, which seemed like an absolutely normal thing to do. We headed into the first spot we could find and grabbed seats at a foretop, and there we sat. Nobody came over to take our order. The joint was full of bikers who were all staring. Naturally, we assumed this was because we were hot, tan twins. Finally, 2 bikers walked over and kicked out the other 2 chairs at our table, leaning over to say, "Your kind is not welcome here." Surprised, we responded, "Cali girls?" Their response, "No, Mexicans." We were blown away. We didn't want to get into a fist fight, so we got up to leave. On our way out, we asked the band to play California Girls by the Beach Boys. No clue if they obliged because we got the fuck out of there. At the end of the block, there was a jazz club with a very different clientele. We poked our heads in and asked if we could come in. We were welcomed, openly and warmly. We stayed there until late that night, drinking and laughing with the locals. It would appear that there are 2 sides of Mobile, Alabama.
Brie. While that night ended well, it was the first time that Nikki and I had ever experienced overt racism. Both California and Arizona were melting pots, and we were certainly not the only girls around who came from an ambiguous mixture of races and cultures. We've since done genetic reports that confirmed we are part Mexican, Italian, Native American, British, etc. The South was a new sort of reality. Even Northern Florida, surprisingly enough. In our time at FCW, we once wrestled at a boys and girls club where people in the crowds yelled, "Spick, spick, spick." There were far too many Confederate flags around town for us to feel comfortable. While the racism was deeply fucked up, it put some of the locker room bullshit into proper perspective. While we didn't have it in us to try to win over the hearts and minds of the KKK, we did feel strong enough to endure some hate from the other female wrestlers. And we understood their frustration. There had been wrestlers on the indie market for years trying to get into the developmental program, and we had cut the line. We didn't come from wrestling royalty, and we hadn't put in years wrestling abroad in the independents. But we felt strongly that even though roster sizes seemed limited, our success was not an impediment to anyone else making it. The WWE is very fluid, where you can go up and down from developmental to the main roster overnight. Vince McMahon let us all be the creators of our own destiny. The fact that anyone was there meant they had a shot too, and we weren't going to take that from them. Honestly, it felt like if there had been less attention spent on trying to pull each other off the top turnbuckle, more of us would have made it up there.
Nicole. WWE's plan was to build out part of a canned food factory into a full-fledged FCW center. This has since happened, and it's spectacular. But its origins were far more humble. We helped put up the first 2 rings in there, which is wild, and those rings shared space with the canned foods. In fact, the cans became our favorite props when they taught us how to cut promos. They were all staged in either a grocery store, a gas station, or an airline thanks to the backdrop. It was also swelteringly hot and humid, as it is inclined to be in Florida in the summer. There was no AC, and while we'd roll the garage doors up to try to get some sort of cross breeze going, we baked in there. We would change the mats 4 times a day because they would get so slick with sweat. It was really nasty. So nasty that Brie and I got ringworm on our cheeks. We never figured out which wrestler infected everyone else, but it's almost surprising that we didn't come down with worse. It was a swamp of wrestling sweat. When we arrived, the canned food factory wasn't yet a reality, and so they had 2 rings set up at a batting cage, frequented by all the local Little Leaguers. It didn't dampen how amazing the scene was. We acted like rabid WWE fans, jaws on the floor when we first walked in. We had never seen advanced wrestling live before, and we bought every bump they threw. Steve Kern, one of the coaches, turned to the other coach, Dr. Tom Pritchard, and said, "Tom, I think they think this is real." They put us right into the fire and asked the other girls to go at us hard and throw us around until we learned how to take the hits and fall right. The girls certainly obliged. We learned how to tuck our chins and land in certain ways to lessen the impact. When you don't know what you're doing, you feel all of it, and it kills. But we loved it. Because we knew we were really green and had so much to learn, we attended night classes to try to get better. Tom gave us a lot of extra attention because we were so eager. It's funny because he is such a big, manly wrestler, but he's the one who came up with the backflip into the ring and the Bella booty shake. Who would have guessed? I picked our entrance music, though. I'm a Shine by Youngbloods, not realizing that the lyrics were about strippers. I thought they were so uplifting. I was thinking, I'm going to shine out there. All in, we were wrestling for 8 to 10 hours a day. We'd take a short break before night school to nap. We'd get up early in the morning to power walk with bands and saran wrap tight around our waists before wrestling. Don't ask, not a good idea, but we thought it would help us shed water weight fast. Other than that, it was eating, wrestling, and sleeping. We were intent on making it. Physical storytelling, using our bodies to portray fear, anger, pain, triumph, felt like what we had always been meant to do. About 2 months in, we had our first match. Brie and I took on Chrissy Vane and Natty, and we beat them. Or, to be more precise, they put us over. The thing about developmental is that the matches are amazing. For one, everyone is trying to get to the main roster, and you can feel that desire in the way all the women fight. But more important, we weren't limited by time the way you are in live and TV events, when women typically only got about 2 minutes per match at the time. There also weren't expectations that we'd pull each other's hair, spectacles that are still part of main stage fights. Instead, it was pretty straightforward wrestling. But instead of performing in front of arena crowds, we went at each other in church parking lots and high school auditoriums, where there might be a dozen people in the stands. All in, we spent 14 months in developmental, and I'm grateful for every minute that we had. Getting to the main stage is all about timing. Some girls moved up in 2 months because the WWE creative team felt like a male wrestler needed a valet or manager and wanted a specific look. But we were happy to stick around at FCW for as long as they would have us and really learn how to wrestle. Once you're on the main roster and on the road all week, you don't really get a chance to train. Instead, you learn through matches, and those matches are short. The other upside of staying in developmental is that there wasn't TV time down there yet. Now it's a massive production, and so we got to stay under the radar. There was also no social media, so there was no pressure to build a massive following. At best, you would make flyers and pass them out for shows. We didn't even have Facebook profiles. Nobody had any idea that there were twins down in developmental. Wild to think about that now. While we both would have loved to assume we could make it to the main roster on our own as solo performers, our pull was in our twindom, as had been the case throughout our lives. More specifically, our power source was the fact that we were identical. Kind of. When we started at FCW, Brie weighed 117 pounds. She was essentially like a baby deer, and looked like she could be snapped in two when she was up against some of the stronger women. I hadn't weighed 117 pounds in more than a decade, partly because my boyfriend liked me as thick as possible, and I loved that. We were both put on diets. Let's just say that Brie's was more fun than mine, until we looked more alike than we had in years. That is, we looked alike until my nose was flattened into my face. At that point, WWE had already put the gears in motion to bring us up to the main roster. So they went back to the drawing board. They came up with the idea of twin magic, i.e. keeping me under the stage until the end of Brie's matches, so I could come out refreshed and win. While I've never been inclined to hang back, the chance to debut as wrestlers, rather than go on the arm of one of the dudes, wasn't something I was going to turn down. Plus, as the older sister by 16 minutes, I thought it might be time to let Brie go first. Chapter 2. Learning to Fight. Nicole. Legend has it that I drop-kicked Brie into my mom's ribcage so I could make my grand entrance a full 16 minutes before her. But I think Brie hung back on purpose. She's always been more of a homebody, more reserved, to let me test the waters. My parents met when they were in high school, after my dad had already managed to father a kid at 16. He didn't find out about our sibling until after we were born. He's Mexican and dashing, and he also came from a really messed up background. My mom was completely in love with him, which was at odds with her parents who were strict and Catholic. It was a potent combination and a story as old as time. Brie and I came blasting into the world when my mom was just 19, her freshman year at the University of San Diego. When my mom left for college, my dad, who didn't go to school, followed her and took a job as a busser at a restaurant called Milton's off Del Mar Heights. It's still there. We were born on November 21st, a full month early. If I had to guess, I'd say we were conceived on Valentine's Day. Because of my mother's state, my grandparents felt it best that she leave college and take up residence in a girls' home in Mission Hills. There, she would have the company and communion of other girls in similar straits. Hopefully, they'd be protected from the judgment and gossip of their Catholic peers. The health care she received during her pregnancy was really basic. Her insurance didn't cover ultrasounds, so the doctor just listened for a heartbeat during checkups. She was massive, really huge, but the doctor never thought to listen for a second baby. He just assumed she was having a very healthy boy. My mom wasn't allowed to have much contact with my dad when she was at home. Visits were only allowed occasionally, so they wrote each other a lot of love letters. My mom doesn't talk about it much, but I'm guessing it was really romantic. The forced separation, my mom in dire straits, this incoming family that they would need to provide for, and my grandfather was insistent that my mom not marry my dad under duress. He wanted to be sure that it would be a choice of love and something that my mom really wanted, not something she was forced into just because they had a kid. My grandfather knew a bit about my dad's background. My dad is the sort of person who is always preceded by his reputation, and so my grandfather had always been compassionately wary of him. When my dad was expelled from high school for fighting, my grandfather had stepped in and advocated on my dad's behalf, arguing that he was a troubled boy who needed the structure of a place to go and the backbone of an education. They took my dad back in. So he cared, but he might not have cared to have him as a son-in-law necessarily. When my mom went into labor, I came out at 5 pounds. They cut the umbilical cord, not realizing that Brie was still up there breached in my mom's ribs, which immediately put her life in peril. It was many, many minutes later that a very wise nurse realized there was another heartbeat, and in a panic instructed my mom to push. "Nope, I'm not pushing," was her response, which is so our mother. She can be mad stubborn. Brie came out at 4.8 pounds, not breathing, because without the umbilical cord she hadn't been getting any oxygen. But Brie was not about to go down that easy. After they resuscitated her, they put her in an incubator and tucked me in there alongside her to help her heart keep beating. My dad went out to the waiting room to tell my Nana that not only did she finally get her first granddaughter, but she got 2. It was a huge shock to everyone, though in looking at photos of my pregnant mother, I'm not sure how anyone was surprised. I guess it was before the days when IVF became so common and twins were a rarity. As my mom tells it, we attracted attention everywhere we went, particularly because we liked to hold hands, even when we were tiny babies.
Brie. We went home from the hospital on Thanksgiving Day, and then my mom drove us straight to our grandparents' house in Phoenix. My mom had just turned 19, and she desperately needed the help. The prospect of mothering one kid when she was still a kid herself had seemed overwhelming, but twins were impossible. My grandparents were very hands-on, more like parents than grandparents, really. They were incredibly gracious about helping and ensuring that we had the best chance at thriving. Ultimately, our parents ended up getting married a year and a half after we were born. We come from a produce farming family. Our grandfather was first generation from Italy and manned a produce store on South Street in Philadelphia. He and his 4 brothers moved west after World War II because the land was cheap and it seemed like a great opportunity. They became some of the first farmers in Southern California. They started an operation called the Colase Brothers, which ultimately became 5 Crowns and then Majesty. Throughout our early childhood, our parents were itinerant, moving from Phoenix to Brawley, California, where the crops are located. Then back to Phoenix, rinse and repeat. My dad was going to school to become a sheet metal mechanic so that he could install ductwork for ACs, while my mom went to work when we were 3 months old at a women's clothing boutique in El Centro called Cinderella. None of it was very stable. The way we lived throughout our childhood probably goes a long way toward explaining why both Nicole and I desperately crave having a real home, yet cannot stay rooted in any house for long. My dad's childhood was terrible, the stuff of cautionary tales. When he was 1, his dad, who was working 2 jobs to support the family, fell asleep on Highway 5 in California and went off the road and died. They were living on the Tijuana border at the time, and his mom, who was a heroin addict, felt overwhelmed by the responsibility, ditched her kids without telling anyone, and ran away. Our dad's grandmother found them days later, a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, sitting on the table. My dad's older brother was feeding him. When my dad was 13, he was in the hospital with a broken arm. He was waiting and waiting for his grandmother, the only woman who had ever really loved or mothered him, to come. A nurse walked into the room to tell him that she had just dropped dead. There was no ceremony, no emotion. Nobody knew where to send the boys until an aunt and uncle agreed to take them in. Despite the open doors, it wasn't a home filled with love. He was never allowed to mourn his grandmother. There was no tenderness where he landed. When he started dating my mom in high school, our grandfather recognized his pain, this poor kid who had only ever known tragedy, hardness, and loss. My pop could sense how awful it had been for him, but I think he also knew that there were limits to what he, or my mom, could do to really heal those wounds. I'm sure my mom, who was warm and competent and had only ever known the assurance of a loving and stable home, thought she was up for it. She could nurture him to a place of safety and love. I think we all have that hubris when we're young, that desire to save, and that belief that we can. Obviously, it was beyond my mom's capacity, particularly at the age of 20. When we were young, our dad would cry about his grandmother. It was hard to feel sympathy, to soften toward him, to accept any of his apparent pain and grief as an excuse for the fact that he then passed all of his hurt onto us. It felt like one more way that he was trying to share responsibility for his violent behavior by making his grief something we needed to share. But on the flip side, we knew he was a deeply pained and hurt man.
Nicole, I'm not one to ever argue with fate, and I can't say that I'm mad I'm here. But our parents were kids who hadn't worked through their own childhood baggage, and they definitely weren't ready to shepherd us through ours. It would be putting it nicely to say that they were ill-equipped. My parents were so young when they had us that they named me after their favorite babysitters from childhood. One was named Nicole, the other was Stephanie. They didn't like how Nicole Stephanie sounded, so they named me Stephanie Nicole, after my dad's favorite babysitters, and then referred to me as Nicole. Only my soccer team ever called me Stephanie. Our childhood was tough, and on the whole, our house was unhappy. This was the 80s and early 90s, when some people still spanked their kids. A lot of what happened to us was borderline acceptable, hotly debated but not officially labeled as abuse. It was certainly not nearly as stigmatized as it is now. As we grew older and started going to friends' houses for playdates and sleepovers, the difference between our home and how our friends were raised became starker. Our parents fought all the time. They told us that they fought like that because they loved each other. It has taken many, many years and a ton of expensive therapy for both of us to begin to separate fighting and love, to realize that they do not coexist to that extent in healthy relationships. We never knew what would cause our dad to fly off the handle. It wouldn't take much, sometimes just a day that was too hot, but he would get worked up and angry to the point of blacking out. Our dad had a lock on our mom's heart, and if I were to guess, I'm sure she felt responsible for some of the pain that he had endured as a kid. She didn't want to pile on with more loss and abandonment. I believe she still thought that she could save him, that we would all be enough to heal his heart. I don't think she realized that she was letting him sink the whole lifeboat in the process, with the 3 of us kids in there too. He had a terrible temper, and was almost constantly angry and scary. There was too much fighting, sometimes physical, and our dad used drugs. It was too much for our house to ever feel stable. It is very clear now, starkly clear, that the only person who could save him was my dad himself, but he operated unconsciously. He never showed remorse afterward, never really cracked enough to create a conversation about whether there was a better way to be. There were a lot of hope spots, too. These kept us all clinging to the fantasy that it could get better, that we could be a happy family. My parents would host these parties. They loved having people over to watch boxing, for example, and everything at our house would seem so fun just for that night, before something would set our dad off again. They also did a lot of stuff for us together, like they would both come to our ballet classes or soccer practices, which always made us feel like we were a little normal, or even indulged. Most kids only had one parent present, if that. We had 2. They never missed a game. Our father would cook dinner or pick us up if we needed him to, and he was fiercely but not overly protective in a way that would make us feel loved, guarded, and cherished. But ultimately, his mood could all change in an instant. There was no rhyme or reason, and we spent our childhood walking on eggshells, hoping we wouldn't step on a landmine. There were a lot of conversations between me and Brie that went something like this. Gosh, does Dad love us at all? Is this what it's supposed to feel like?
Brie. The yelling and fighting and door slamming was a constant soundtrack in our house. I think our soccer coaches knew what was going on, but I often wonder if anyone else was aware of how turbulent our home life was. Nicole and I would put up a front that we were strong, but inside, we had imploded. We had no confidence. We were terrified. It sort of felt like we were living a double life. In front of my grandparents, we pretended like our home life was perfect, wholesome, and complete. I think they knew that it was actually broken, that we were being hurt by our dad, and that it was all very toxic. I think that's why they insisted on playing such significant roles in our childhood and having such a heavy influence. Every summer, all my aunts and uncles and cousins would go and stay with Nana and Pop Pop in Lake Tahoe. It was the best time ever, a profound relief from home. We could be with people we loved without fear of setting them off or facing retribution for some small and invisible infraction. My grandparents had a condo next to the Hyatt, and we would spend a lot of our time there, trying to make a quick buck, always. When we were in 5th grade, we put out a tip bucket in front of the gift shop and danced around modeling sunglasses. Our idea, not theirs. We asked the umbrella guys on the beach if they would let us be their umbrella girl assistants for scavenged tips. They obliged. We also pilfered Hyatt lotions and shampoos and tried to sell them on the beach. We made friends with all the tourists who came from Chicago, New York, and Texas, and we learned all about their lives. And I had my first makeout session with a cute boy from San Jose there one summer. We went to the arcade and won tickets for stuffed animals. We went out on my uncle's boat. It was like the best summer camp ever. We were allowed to run free with our cousins within a safe and contained environment. I think that's why we turned out how we did. Being in that environment made us want to be better. We became aware that things could feel safer and healthier and quieter. Our grandparents' love was profound and stable, and everything that we ultimately wanted in our own lives. Summers were always a period of peace that we could look forward to. They taught us to look for sanctuary back home, too, even if it was in walks to church, just the 2 of us. We joined the choir because we knew it would be orderly and calm, and we would be around good people. When you grow up how we did, you equate love and pain. That chased Nicole in particular through most of her early relationships. She didn't know how to accept love and affection unless it also hurt. My mom was thoroughly under my dad's spell throughout our childhood. I don't think she can fathom how she let it happen, except the belief that she could pull my dad through, that it would somehow change, that it was better to all be together than apart. I don't think that she realized she was actually teaching us that love can feel conditional and unreliable, that she was creating a foundation for us that was unstable and full of cracks, rather than the bedrock we so desperately craved. To this day, Nicole and I can transition from full expletive meltdowns to peaceful dinner invitations. It has been up to people like my husband Brian to show us that it's not normal or maintainable to act like that. And honestly, he has the patience of a saint. It has required a lot of therapy. People have had to bring awareness of our behavior to us, because like our dad, we can almost go unconscious in moments of rage and not even remember what we said. Understanding how to react without feeling overwhelming and immediate rage, practicing emotional containment instead of ramping to an extreme reaction, it is tough stuff. It is probably ironic that we fight for a living, but part of the process has been transmuting the pain of our childhood into something productive. We prove to ourselves and others that it's possible to get up again, that you can defend yourself. You can move through a whole spectrum of emotions while simultaneously supporting those who are in battle with you. Wrestling is not a winner-take-all proposition. It is much more complicated than that. And so too is our relationship with our dad. It is possible to not want a lot to do with him while still loving him from afar. It is possible to wish our childhood had been different while also being thankful that it turned us into the women we have become. I think that when you feel victimized, it is difficult, if not impossible, not to feel like you should shoulder some of the blame, that you inspired it, that you deserved it, that you participated in some way. Nicole and I have worked really hard to refuse to pick up that mantle in all ways. We don't want to be known as victims, ever. And we certainly don't want to act like victims either. When you accept victimhood, then you are effectively letting the abuse happen again and again in real time. It is a subtle but important thing. You have a responsibility to yourself to process and work through pain, which is very different from taking on the responsibility of it happening in the first place. We have done a lot of work to let go of the anger and to only use it as motivation, never as an excuse.
Nicole. I always wanted to be an entertainer and have been pursuing it since I was young. I wanted to be a supermodel like Naomi Campbell and Cindy Crawford. It never occurred to me that I was at an extreme height disadvantage. I never believed that there were any limits, which is pretty great in retrospect. When our parents' friends came over, we'd arrange them in the living room and dress up as Posh and Sporty Spice and sing Wannabe, a big hit at the time. Tell me what you want, what you really, really want. In retrospect, this was probably mortifying for our mother, but we didn't understand the lyrics. We were only in it for the audience. At school, I was very active in drama and would always raise my hand for roles in these short films we would make as classroom projects. I always picked the ones where someone got killed, like Jawbreakers. At one point, I was licking barbecue sauce off a long knife with a lot of enthusiasm. My teacher looked at me and said, "Can we talk after class?" The teachers knew what was going on, and I think my apparent relish for violence made them nervous. It's easy to understand how they thought that we would be going down a darker path. But I really just enjoyed acting, not because it was evidence of homicidal motives. For what it's worth, I also aced the monologue from Clueless where Cher debates Amber about the refugee crisis. I liked the attention, and I liked to be looked at, until a couple classmates my freshman year did something terrible. It was lunchtime, and we were all hanging out in the cafeteria. I was wearing a skirt and a thong, and they took a photo up my skirt. I remember walking into school a few days later, and everyone was staring at me. By third period, a guy friend pulled me aside. "These two kids took a photo up your skirt, and they're passing copies of it around." It was horrible. The whole idea was invasive and mortifying on its own, but the photo was also distorted, and I had an ingrown hair on the bottom of my butt cheek which looked massive and red because of the angle. I felt so violated, so humiliated. The principal got involved and put the two freshmen into detention. I was close to a bunch of senior guys who tried to beat them up in there. And then my dad showed up. He threatened to kill the boys and their families and had to be restrained by cops, adding to the drama and embarrassment. I locked myself in my room and refused to come out for days. That was the first bad sexual thing that had ever happened to me. I remember thinking, why did they choose me? Why did they need to humiliate me in particular? Was I asking for it? There are no good answers to questions like that, and it's a major problem with our culture that women are always asking them. It was just a fucked up thing to do. A prank from some dumb boys who hadn't been taught any better. A few weeks later, I wanted to walk home by myself. I think I was still struggling from the photo episode, and Brie had volleyball practice. I told my friends I was sick so they would leave me alone. I was walking on the sidewalk when an old Cadillac came so close it actually grazed my leg. The person who was driving it was moving at a crawling pace, but it still shocked me and I jumped back. I looked over and saw a guy in a trucker hat through the open window, and he was jacking off as he tried to grab me with his other hand. And then he yelled, "Get inside and suck my dick." I started sprinting for a neighbor's house, and he floored it. He did the same thing a week later to a 4th grade boy and was arrested. We found out that he actually lived in our neighborhood.
Brie. That wasn't the last drama of our freshman year. We were also stalked by a guy in a pickup truck. He followed Nicole and me home from school one day, and we jumped some walls to escape him. Later, he parked near our house, and we could tell that he was touching himself because of the weird faces he was making. It was a sad realization to have come to when you're 14 years old. We told our dad, who must have alerted the neighborhood, because later that week, I was standing in the kitchen when the landline rang. It was my dad, and he said, "Brie, the guy is parked down the street. I want you to go and lock the door right now." It suddenly felt like the front door was 500 miles away as I raced to latch it, like in a bad horror movie. My dad called the cops, and they arrested the guy. It turned out that he lived an hour away. I'm not sure how he found us, or why he picked us as his targets, but these incidents were some of the first times I realized that strangers could be malevolent. Brian always gives me a hard time for being freaked out about being alone at night, but I think most women understand why it is justified to feel scared. Even though I know how to fight and could theoretically protect myself, someone could have a gun. And like I said, I learned at a young age that the world is full of creeps. Nicole and I just decided that we should assume everyone is a serial killer. I remember one night, Nicole and our friend Julia and I were walking home after a shift at Hooters, to the cute apartment that we all shared in San Diego. We were walking up to our building when a man came running out, and our neighbor from upstairs came running after him. It turned out that the guy had been in our apartment, sitting on our couch, holding our underwear. And it wasn't the first time he had been there, because that same upstairs neighbor told us he had seen him coming out of our apartment before. The world is apparently full of weirdos. For that reason, even though Nicole and I have been perfectly capable of getting wild, we've always been really careful about going home with strangers or walking alone late at night. You can never be too safe. The Christmas of our sophomore year, our dad had told us that he was going on some sort of spiritual soul journey, a trip to find himself. My mom bought him presents for this soul journey and wrapped them and put them under the tree. After we opened gifts on Christmas morning, he bounced. We later found out that this Christmas soul journey took place on a cruise with another woman.
Nicole. My mom couldn't keep it from us. She dropped to her knees on the kitchen floor, crying and crying. What was worse, the woman he was having an affair with was the team mom from my brother's Little League team. This made it more embarrassing, more hurtful, and more problematic for all of us. Her parents called my mom, I think, because they didn't want JJ and their grandson to be affected, for it to become the talk of the neighborhood. Ultimately, it did anyway. My dad was never faithful, and from what I recall, my parents separated a couple of times over the years. We visited him in some sort of apartment where he was living while he waited for my mom to take him back. And she always did, even though he cheated constantly and she usually heard about it. My mom is a great woman, and she was beloved throughout our community. When people knew that my dad was up to something, they always told her. They just cared about her too much. And I'm sure they thought that she would finally be ready to leave. But she was really, really taken with him. Addicted in some ways. And I think she was terrified by the possibility of creating a broken home. For whatever reason, I think she believed that an unhappy home was a better alternative for the 5 of us than divorce. She thought that my dad had been the victim of that sort of drift, and she would be subjecting us to a similar fate. On that point, she was wrong.
Brie. After the Christmas cruise, my dad stayed away from the family for a while. Then he popped back up again and wanted to come home and pretend like everything was normal. I'm not sure how he persuaded my mom, but she let him back in. Nicole and I were furious and would have nothing to do with him, much less continue with the charade that we were a normal family. Our refusal to talk to him only enraged him more because he felt like we were disrespecting his authority. Right before spring break, we got into a massive fight. Nicole was grounded and decided to put the time to good use and get some sun by the pool. She went to lay out in her pink bikini, which was when my parents, already upset that she wasn't in her room, noticed that she had gotten a tattoo. We actually both had in a rebellious fit a few weeks before. The fight quickly escalated, and both of my parents followed Nicole into her room. From what I recall, my mom got in Nicole's face, and Nicole pushed her back. My dad hit Nicole in the face, and she fell into the curtains, while I jumped on his back to stop him. He picked us both up and threw us out of the house. Both of my parents were responsible for that. I was in pajamas. I don't think either of us were wearing shoes. We went to our friend Tammy's house and crashed with her for a few days until her parents got suspicious and called my mom. She told us they were coming to get us, and we called our friend Ariel, the only 16-year-old girl we knew who could drive, and then Nicole and I tried to run. Tammy's stepdad grabbed us as we made for the door, and Nicole karate chopped his arm and booked it through the rain into the darkness. He just yelled after her in French. Nicole jumped in Ariel's pickup and took off into the night. But after the runt, I couldn't get free. My dad was convinced that we were on drugs. As I told him that day, I wasn't dumb, and I had no intention of being like him in any way. Save for a little bit of pot, I've never really touched the stuff. They took me to get drug tested anyway because my dad wouldn't let it go. I think he was eager to project his own stuff onto us, to find someone else to blame for his scary behavior. Then my parents put me under their version of house arrest, minus the electric anklet. I was a smart kid, and I stashed a phone under my bed so I could call and check in on Nicole and leave money out for her.
Nicole. Ironically, that week that I spent as a runaway was actually the first time I saw hard drugs. It was spring break, and so there were parties at parent-vacated homes every night. After most kids would head home for curfew, I'd stay behind and crash out. Late into the night, kids were doing crack. Really hard drugs. It was terrifying to see and really sad, but I had nowhere else to go. The cops kept calling my phone and leaving me messages that if I didn't come in, they'd arrest me. So I finally showed up at the station. My parents had told them that I ran away because I was on drugs, so they drug tested me. I told them my story and asked them to call the school, to have them vouch for my dad's history of getting physical with us. And I had taken a photo of my face after he had hit me. Teachers and security guards at the school had seen things over the years. Once my dad and I got into it when he was dropping me off, and he threw a box of Kleenex at my head. A security guard came up to the truck and got in my dad's face about it. I told the cops I would rather go to juvie than go home to live with my dad again. And they believed me. My mom realized it was over. She needed to kick my dad out of the house so I could come home, though she was still upset that I had made the decision for her. I came home and immediately started throwing all of my dad's shit into the driveway. It's really hard for my mom to talk about. I think when you are abused, you lose your head a little bit. It happens to strong and smart women all the time. They stay because they think maybe it will get better, or they're too scared to walk away because they fear the retribution will be worse. The pervasive theme is that they don't feel like they can tell anyone, because maybe they won't be believed. Police intervention was the wake-up call that my mom needed to choose our health and safety over my dad. My mom was devastated. I don't think she was truly upset with us, but I do think she was blown away that it had escalated to that point, that she had let it unfold for so many years without doing anything to make it stop. As our family secret blew open, she almost couldn't believe it herself, as much as she knew it was all true. The four of us have recovered from those hard years, though, and have an incredibly strong bond. We know our mom would move mountains for us, and we have endless respect for her business acumen and insight, even though it's the only thing she wants to talk about.
Brie. We were really close to my Nana and Pop Pop, and it was always tempting to go to them and tell them what was happening inside our family. It would have been so comforting to be able to confide in them and to have their protection. At the same time, we couldn't bear the idea of how painful the full story would be to them. I think they were always concerned that things might not be okay behind closed doors, but we always managed to put on brave faces. We reassured them that we were, in fact, just great. That's just how Nicole and I are. We don't want sympathy. We don't want people to worry or feel sorry for us. We want our connections with other people to be real and not based on them feeling bad. Plus, we've always been inclined to put the needs of others before our own. If our grandparents had known, they wouldn't have been able to sleep at night. After my dad finally left, we tried to establish a new normal, and my mom started going out a lot with her friends. I think it was her first chance to be young. She had been forced to skip that phase because she had us when she was just a teenager. She also seemed happy and relieved, like an unburdened version of herself. She started to date a guy who was the opposite of my dad. He drove a motorcycle, but that was the extent of his edge. He was sweet and quiet and very sensitive. He owned his own company and had his life together. It was really nice for us to see her with a guy who deserved her. We were struggling financially, so we ultimately had to move into a smaller house. It was really cute, maybe 1,600 square feet or so. It only had 3 bedrooms, so Nicole and I shared a room again, and I shared the master bath with my mom. The backyard had a mini pool that consumed the entire space, a necessity during Arizona summers, and the living room was really cozy. My dad had always insisted on having this heavy Western furniture. My mom's first go at decorating on her own was so much softer and more feminine. It really felt like a home. When Nicole and I moved to Tampa for FCW, we ended up taking all that furniture with us because my mom married her boyfriend and moved in with him. My dad really struggled. He wasn't always pleasant, he wasn't always nice, and he made it really hard. There definitely were good times, but there were more hard times. When you're a kid, the bad outweighs the good. It's so traumatizing when you're little. Those memories are really tough to shake. As an adult, you're much more equipped to be able to brush off the tough stuff. When you're a kid, it sticks. I don't think my dad ever even went to rehab. He just gave up drugs on his own. Throughout our life, I never really knew if he was controlled by an addiction or just had a strong preference for drugs. He clearly really enjoyed them, but he also seemed capable of cutting them out and going cold turkey. I didn't really know. That assessment might not be giving addiction the power and credit it deserves. It could have been more of a struggle, but to me, it always felt like it was a choice. Drugs offered a path that was easier than being responsible for his family, and so he just chose drugs instead. As a kid, I had no concept of what he was up to. He didn't seem enslaved, just angry and hurt. From what Brian tells me, my husband's childhood seems different. His dad was ruled by alcohol. He would have done anything to liberate himself from addiction, but he couldn't stay sober. I spent a lot of my life being really angry at my dad. In some ways, I was enslaved by the pain of my childhood. I told myself I didn't want to engage with him or go there. I just didn't have the energy to deal with all that he brings. I think the real reason, though, was that he never owned his part. He never took accountability for what he did to our family or acknowledged that he created a lot of pain. When you're the one who felt that pain, That is incredibly frustrating. It feels victimizing and disempowering. I just didn't want to go to the mat with him to try to make him own his behavior. When Birdie was about 1, my dad reached out. He drove to San Diego to meet her, and we had an incredibly moving conversation. My dad is 52 now and has other kids, a daughter who is older than Nicole and me, and also 2 young ones, a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old. When I saw my dad again, it was clear that he has changed profoundly. His new kids are having a far different childhood than we did. When we sat down to talk, my dad was beyond the denial phase. He owned everything. He acknowledged how ill-equipped he had been. He had been doing the best he could with what little he had, and he admitted that he had offloaded his pain on us in a way that was unfair and unforgivable. I was able to release all the anger and hate I felt for him and to grieve our relationship so I could forgive him. I realized that the pain had been a horrible burden to carry. Even though I'd pretended like I hadn't really cared, the anger and hate had been binding me to the trauma. It was re-victimizing me. It wasn't healthy. I also knew that if I want to model good relationships for Birdie, I have to learn how to have those hard conversations. I have to process what comes up for me without just shutting down. If someday Birdie and Brian were to fight, I wouldn't want her to think it was okay to shut the door on him because I shut the door on my own dad. My dad and I are in a process of deep recovery. We're letting all the negativity go and finding a path to having a real relationship. I'm finding a way to celebrate all of his good qualities, like the fact that he is an incredibly hard worker. He works at a solar farm, and every week he drives 6 hours to spend time with his family. He has always been like that, always worked tirelessly. Now that I'm a mom, I understand the concept of unconditional love, how deep and basic and profound it is. I know my dad loves me, and I know he always loved me. I didn't always feel it as a kid, but there's no version of life where loving someone means that you'll never screw up. I just don't think he could help it. He wasn't prepared to be a good dad. He'd never had a model of how it can be done. I'm gratified that he is doing so much better, that he is now at peace, and that, despite it all, Nicole and I have turned out well. For better or for worse, he taught us how to fight, and he certainly knew how. Chapter 3. Bear. 2001 to 2002. Scottsdale, Arizona. Brie. It was toward the end of summer up in Bear's attic. It was late at night, a testament to the fact that neither of us had school the next day. Bear sat on a stool in front of me, all 6'1" of him, and held a canvas, swirling paint and dabbling it here and there. He had shaggy blonde hair, full lips. He was painting my portrait, and for the first time ever, it felt like I was actually being seen. His real name was Edward, but everyone who knew him called him Bear. Everyone who knew him loved him. He was just one of those people, wise beyond his years, kind, calm, prophetic. He was beautiful. Nicole and I went to Chaparral High, a big public school in Scottsdale, Arizona. We were both good soccer players. Nicole was particularly talented, which I'll let her tell you about, though I hated the game and had been forced by my parents to play it since I was a kid. It held no joy for me, but my parents believed that good kids played sports, and so doing something else was not an option. I was a reasonably popular girl in high school, though I didn't really care either way, and I didn't associate with any specific group. My best friend Katie and I floated around, hanging out with the skater boys one day, the drama kids the next. Honestly, chili cheese Fritos and Dr. Peppers were the only constants. I never really felt a strong urge to belong. I think probably because I always had my sister to turn to, a constant reminder of myself. She hung out with the cool kids at the Ramada, one of those buildings without walls where we'd all take shelter from the hot Arizona sun. I spent plenty of time with Nicole at home, so at school, I primarily hung out with my sidekick, Katie. My sister and I were part of a church youth group, where I became close to 2 people in a pretty unlikely way, We were on our way to a retreat and were packed into a school bus. It was a rowdy crowd of high school juniors, even though we were all supposed to be devout Catholics. Nicole went to the bathroom and didn't return for a while, so I walked to the back to investigate. She was screaming through the door that someone had locked her inside. Nicole and I have really aggressive and quick tempers, so I rounded on the two people sitting across from the door, accusing them of pranking my sister. They looked at me like I was nuts while I continued to yell at them for being messed up assholes. And then my sister figured out how to work the door and stepped out like nothing had happened. Typical Nicole. Despite our aggressive introduction, Jason and Elizabeth became close friends. They went to a private school, St. Mary's. Katie and I started hanging out with them so much, it would have been easy to assume we went to St. Mary's too. Katie even ended up dating Jason, who became her high school sweetheart. A few months later, Jason and Elizabeth took us to a party. I was nervous when I walked in because it was a sea of people I didn't know. Nicole is far more extroverted than I am, and really easy in a crowd. She's kind of my social beard in strange situations. When she's not around, I tend to keep to myself and find the nearest corner. Katie and I walked outside, and I saw a guy at the end of the table. He was wearing a baseball t-shirt with yellow sleeves, and he was clearly a skater, my weakness, and a really handsome one at that. The light hit him in a certain way, though he was one of those guys who would shine in the dark. Just a star, able to draw attention in a low-key way. It was hard not to stare. Bear was a smartass, and he teased me all night in a way that would be easy to mistake for flirting. We didn't exchange numbers. I left that night so bummed that he didn't ask. But by that point, everything had become about St. Mary's. I totally skipped out on the Chaparral High crew, and we started running into each other all the time at parties. There was a big kegger one night, and kids from across town were going to be there. I knew Bear would be there too. I was really excited to see him, but a fight broke out between the two high school boy groups over something stupid, and the whole crowd dispersed. We ended up back at Katie's, and somehow Bear found his way there. Our parents got divorced when we were 15, though they had been on and off for years. When they decided to make it official, everything went sideways, and they kicked us out of the house. Nicole was considered a runaway for a week and wouldn't go back home until my mom agreed to fully kick my dad out. One of the things that had precipitated running away was the fact that Nicole and I had decided to get our first tattoos. I got a fairy on my ass because I thought of myself as a free spirit, and Nicole got a heart on fire. They were regrettable, but in that moment, they felt like the only way to rebel. I showed Bear my ass tattoo that night, and then his friends dragged him away. As he was getting in the car, he finally asked for my number. He didn't have a pen, but promised he had a good memory. He told me later that the guys in the car kept trying to mess him up as he repeated my number again and again. He called the next day, and we spoke for 4 hours. In that way you do when you're 17 and you want to know absolutely everything about someone. We talked until we fell asleep on the phone. He told me his favorite color was purple, which I thought was unexpected for a dude. I told him my life story. We talked about our siblings. He had lost his oldest brother, a family tragedy that hadn't seemed to derail his sense of peace and justice. Bear was the baby, the youngest of 6 kids. From that day on, we were inseparable. We had to see each other every day, and we talked all the time, locking up our home phones for hours. We had a profound connection, like we had known each other forever, like it wasn't our first rodeo. He also had a beautiful family. Even though they had suffered such a horrible loss with the death of his brother, they were so positive, so deeply spiritual and grounded. I loved being at their house. It undid some of the bad things that had happened at my own. I was going through so many issues with my own dad that I needed to be around someone who was unwaveringly positive. That was Bear. I never heard him say anything negative. He didn't always say a lot. He was a guy of few words, but when he did speak, it was always the truth, delivered kindly and gently. I remember one day, my dad's girlfriend called me to tell me that my father was in the hospital, that he had cancer. My dad and I weren't speaking, but Bear urged me to go. He told me, if something happens to your dad, do you really want to go through life being mad at him for being a shitty dad? There's so much more to people. They are who they are. Love is always greater. It would have been so much easier for Bear to pile onto my feelings, to pick up the cross of anger that I was already carrying, but he pushed me to start speaking to my dad again instead. Even when it turned out that my dad did not actually have cancer, but was in the hospital because he had overdosed on meth. Bear was really big on forgiveness and really big on making it right with people. I guess you could call it taking care of your side of the street, being responsible for your own part in the relationship. In many ways, you could call Bear religious, but I think a better word is spiritual. He believed in a lot of what Jesus taught. He went to a Catholic high school, but he was more about the spirit of the Bible than the letter. He just breathed living kindness. With everything that had happened with my family, my own faith had definitely drifted. Part of my rebellion was rejecting the church, which had been important to my grandparents. But Bear gave me back my spirituality. I believe he brought me back to myself and grounded me at a time when I felt like I was untethered and most inclined to just float away. The summer before our senior year was magical. While Bear was not my first everything, he was certainly my first love, and it was a deep one. I had lost my virginity to a guy friend from school down at the beach a few months before I met Bear. I thought it was a good idea at the time because he was nice and respectful, and I trusted him, but it was awkward and terrible all around, and the next day I regretted it. That regret, compounded by my Catholic guilt, ended up ruining our relationship. In hindsight, I would have much rather had his friendship than his virginity. Bear and I daydreamed a lot about where we'd go after high school. He thought he'd wear a morning tux to our wedding, that we'd have babies. Bear was an incredible artist, and my primary goal, particularly because I felt so directionless, was to live vicariously through him. When I was in 8th grade, I had asked for a guitar for Christmas, which Santa delivered under the tree. My dad refused to get me lessons because in his mind, only stoners played guitar. I also used to paint all the time, but my parents assumed that anyone who was artsy also did drugs. I think they felt that by forcing me into soccer, they would be assured that I'd have a future free of partying and hard drugs. What they didn't realize was that by disconnecting me from things I actually cared about, they only made me feel more lost. So at school, I threw myself into music, art, drama, and I threw myself into my relationship with Bear, who represented everything I loved and had been denied, everything I hid from my parents at home. One night, after we had been dating for a few months, I walked Bear from my house to his car. We shared a really passionate kiss, one of those kisses that you feel inside your entire body. As we stood outside in the dry desert heat, he asked me if he could do something. He lifted up my shirt, unhooked my bra, and just held me, skin to skin. I could feel the reverberations of his heart in my own. It was a quiet moment, not sexual. It was one of the most powerful and moving things I had ever felt with someone. Bear was such a good artist that the local Starbucks asked to put up a show of his work. He taught himself how to play the piano, how to play the guitar. He was an incredible skateboarder. He was simply perfect, complete, and self-assured. Someone who knew what he wanted. He also had opportunities. Berkeley and colleges in New York were into his stuff. I figured my graduation plan could be to just follow him around if he'd let me. My birthday is in November, and he made me a CD as my gift. His friends mocked him, but I loved it. I've never cared about material things, and if he had gone out and spent money, it would have made me uncomfortable. So he made me a mix and told me that every song had meaning to each of us and to our relationship. He wrote, "For Brie," across the jewel case. My family and friends spell my name B-R-I. I still listen to it today, and it brings me back to our entire relationship, to this incredible guy. It's a complete soundtrack to some of the most magical months of my life, of being with someone who made me feel whole. I'm so grateful that he didn't give me a shirt or something silly that I would have lost or broken over the years. For Christmas, he gave me a Mother Mary necklace for protection that I still treasure. I can't remember what I gave him, though I'm sure it was embarrassing, but he gave me a Mother Mary that was just like him, marking moments like that in ways that were actually meaningful. On January 18th, Bear and I had plans to go and do something. He really wanted to go to the St. Mary's football game, so I told him to come and find me after. Something happened that messed up our plans, and he never came to meet me. It wasn't the age of texting, and so everything was set in the beginning of the night and timed perfectly. If you missed each other, that was your only chance. I was pissed, and we argued. This was really unusual for us, despite my hair-trigger temper. The next day, he called me on my house phone. He told me he was going to skate with his friends and then come find me. We both apologized for the night before and felt silly that it had been enough to make us fight. It was a new day, and I couldn't wait to see him later. That night, January 19th, I waited for him at my house, alone. My mom went out with her girlfriends, my brother was at a friend's house, and my sister, who had fractured her leg 2 weeks before and been stuck in bed ever since, had been dragged out of the house and to a movie by her boyfriend. Bear and his friend Greg were going to pick up our friend Ronnie and then cruise to my house. I knew exactly how long it would take for him to get to me. I remember looking at the clock and thinking, dang, I bet he stopped at a party and I'm once again on the back burner. I started to get annoyed, which built into frustration and anger. Then my sister came through the door, wanting to hang out with Bear. She had been walking into the movie theater with her boyfriend when she asked him to drive her home because she felt a strong urge to see us. And then my brother showed up, wanting to see Bear too. And then my friends Sarah and Val called, wanting to see Bear. Within 30 minutes, I went from sitting and waiting by myself to being surrounded by people who all wanted to see Bear. I mixed some ruby red squirt with a little vodka from my mom's stash and gave everyone a drink. None for JJ, don't worry. Then I thought, oh, Bear's here. I could smell him. I told everyone the boys had finally arrived and walked out to the front. But he wasn't there. I went to the backyard, thinking maybe he had detoured around the house to finish his cigarette. No Bear. Then the phone rang. It was Bear's older brother, Patrick. He said quietly, Brie, Bear has been in a really bad accident. Then he went silent, started crying, and hung up on me. My heart dropped, but I didn't think death. Death was impossible. I called him back. Brie, Bear is dead. He's dead, Brie. I was in the living room, and I tried to grab onto the console, but I collapsed onto the floor. Bear was 17. He was invincible. I had just spoken to him hours before. I begged God to bring him back, pleading and bargaining with him that it wouldn't be weird if he performed a miracle and restarted his heart. This was Bear. Bear was a miracle. I thought if I could get to the hospital, maybe it would be enough to save him. My girlfriend Val drove me there, running every red light on the way. The only miracle that night was that we didn't die as well. I will always remember how that evening smelled, how I could feel death in the hospital. I sat in the emergency room and waited. When they rolled Greg out, he looked like a marshmallow. I remembered thinking that if he was alive and looked like that, I could only imagine what had happened to Bear. Greg and Bear were hit by a guy who was racing to a party. He was intoxicated and driving without a license. It was a hit and run, though they caught him and he spent 7 years in jail. Bear wasn't wearing a seatbelt and was flung from the car, but they think the roll bar of the truck would have smashed him anyway. Greg thinks they were hit twice, but knows for certain that they hit the gravel in the center of the freeway and rolled. He remembers looking at Bear at the moment after they had been hit, when Greg had lost control of the car. Bear just smiled back at him, like he knew, like he had already transcended his body. When the car stopped rolling, Greg sprinted to Bear and held him in his lap, but Bear was already gone. He had died on impact. Everyone met up at a house to pray and be together after. I went, and for the first time, felt like I didn't belong. I was the girl from a different high school, and I felt responsible for taking away their best friend. He meant so much to so many different people. One girl muttered under her breath that if he hadn't been on his way to see me, he wouldn't be dead. I wanted to hear that. In retrospect, that is insane, but it was impossible for me to not want to hold some of the responsibility. It gave his death some meaning and a reason when it felt like it had neither. I was in deep crisis and grief, totally ill-equipped to deal with the loss. When you lose a relationship, it can feel like you lose all the memories you shared because they are too painful to remember. And most strangely, you are suddenly left with days full of holes that were once filled up by someone else. Everything has to shift, which is a terrible exercise when you don't want it to. I wanted to hold that space to think about and mourn Bear, not to just absorb the loss and move on. Feeling normal again was a terrifying idea. I didn't want a new normal without Bear. Every day, I'd had a routine. I went to school, then I went to my mom's office, where I had worked as a receptionist since I was 15, then to Bear's house, until I had to pick up Nicole at the gym, where she manned the front desk. Rinse and repeat. After Bear died, I couldn't go right back to school. I stayed home for several weeks and cried until I was empty. While my friends were busy planning their futures post-graduation, I was just trying to get to the next day. A week ahead seemed impossibly far away. I honestly don't think I would have made it if it weren't for Bear's friends and Bear's mom, who managed somehow to hold us all up in our grief despite their own. I think she knows, I hope she knows, how much that time meant to me. Being a mother now, I can't imagine how she made it through those days, much less how she carried us all through. Bear and his mother shared a strong faith, and just being around her reminded me of him. I could have gone two ways at that time. I could have decided to hate God and tell everyone and everything to fuck itself, but Bear's mom helped me to a different outcome. She helped me to not lose touch with what he had brought into my life, his purpose and his passion. I felt like I had to harness these qualities for myself so they wouldn't be lost. It was far better and more productive than believing he had lived and died for no reason. I started writing, which felt like a way to communicate directly with him. Actually, it's strange, but the Monday before Bear died, we were hanging out at his house. We'd typically start out those nights sitting next to each other on the piano bench while he serenaded me with songs. His family had a library of VHS cassette tapes, movies like My Cousin Vinny, his favorite, and other classics from the 80s and 90s. That night, we were watching something we had probably seen 100 times before, and he turned to me and said something like, "I have this feeling that I'm going to die young, like before I'm 30. I laughed at what I thought was his fantasy of some rock and roll flameout. I didn't realize at the time that his soul was preparing him for death. It was sending up a little warning flare that some things are too good to stick around for long. In retrospect, I realized his dog Maggie was acting weird that week too. She was hovering around him, watching and guarding. I can't help but believe that the gifts he had given me, my Mother Mary necklace, my 4 Brie CD, a clay bear he made for me in pottery class so I'd always have a bear to watch over me at night, were anticipatory totems of protection. They were for when he wouldn't be there himself to protect me. Earlier that year, the Diamondbacks had won the World Series, and the whole town erupted in celebration. Bear lived by the Heard Museum, devoted to American Indian art. There was a vacant house nearby, and one night we hopped a fence and snuck in so we could watch the fireworks from inside. It felt like it was our house that night, and we were watching a celebration of our future. Just the two of us, alone in the world, surrounded by colorful bursts of light. When I'd started dating Bear, I quit soccer. My mom was pissed. Colleges were taking a long look at me, and she thought the possibility of a scholarship was my only chance of going to school. Never mind that I was miserable on the field. "You hate soccer," Bear had said, "so why are you committing yourself to a future where you have to keep playing?" He was right, even though it seemed like a reckless choice at the time, particularly considering I didn't have any other options. "You've got to do what feels right," he always said. "Do what makes you happy." It might sound trite, but this was wise counsel from a high school senior. After he was gone, I tried to bury what he wanted for me in my body and use him as my compass. When I graduated from high school, Bear's mom gave me the portrait that he had painted of me that day in the attic. It was a split face. He had painted a self-portrait to make up the other side, and then he hung the pair on his bedroom wall. He told me that at night, the moon would shine across our eyes, lighting us both up. I still have the painting, and I look at it often. I'm lucky that my husband Brian is so unthreatened by my past and his understanding of what Bear continues to mean to me. But then, I often think that Bear sent him my way. Before I left town for California, I went with Bear's family to get bear claw tattoos on my lower abdomen. It's funny, because I dated a lot of guys throughout the years who did not dig them at all. They were freaked out by their presence. I think of them as a gesture of protection from Bear, a way of warding off guys who have no business being in my life. They are a final totem. I still pray to Bear every day. I ask him for help with difficult situations. I ask him for strength before matches. I ask him for advice about tricky decisions. I ask him if he's doing a big skateboarding ramp up in heaven. If there is a beautiful sunset, I'll ask him if he painted it for me. I have reason to believe that he hears me because he sends me signs all the time. In particular, he sends me feathers at times when I need them most. A bit after Bear died, I was in a bookstore with my sister, browsing the self-help aisle, as one does. I was trying to work through my wanderlust and lack of direction. I passed a shelf with a book that was about bears. I picked it up to flip through it, and a feather fell to the floor. I walked up to the owner of the bookstore and asked him why a feather, which looked like it had been plucked off a bird's ass, was in the book. He looked at me like I was nuts. He took it from me to toss it in the trash, but I asked him if I could keep it, which made him look at me like I was really nuts. Other times, I've asked Bear if he can hear me, and a song from my For Brie CD will come on the radio. To this day, it still happens with so much frequency, it feels impossible that it's a coincidence. I believe that he is my guardian angel. A few months after Bear died, I was hanging out at his friend Austin's house. Austin's mom pulled me aside. I thought she just wanted to check in on me, make sure I was eating and sleeping and taking care of myself. But she told me that she had been in the crystal store in town, and a woman who worked there had called out, "There's a young man here." This woman had described what he looked like and said that he was showing her an image of a bear. She said that the young man had been in a car accident and his life was cut short. Austin's mom raised her hand and told the woman she thought she knew who he was and that he must be trying to reach her. As Austin's mom told me this, I remember looking at her like she was batshit crazy. I wasn't familiar with the concept of psychics and mediums. The Catholic Church, while all about angels, frowns on that sort of thing. Then Austin's mom told me that the woman in the crystal store had mentioned me, as well as Bear's cousin Paul, and that she really needed to speak to us. I told her I didn't believe in that sort of thing, and she nodded. I get it, but I wouldn't feel right if I didn't tell you. She handed me the phone number for the medium, whose name was Trisha. I thought about it for a while. I believed in angels, and I thought I had seen Bear a number of times. I dreamed about him constantly. So, I went to the store, which was called A Piece of the Universe, and found Trisha to test her. "Listen," I said, "I don't know anything about this stuff, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you about my life. What is it exactly that you need?" I was just a high school kid, and I'm sure she didn't really know what to do with me either. But she sat me down and began to channel Bear. I said nothing. She told me things, intimate things, that only the two of us knew. She brought up the night we spent in the vacant house watching the fireworks, which was something Bear and I had kept as a secret for ourselves. I immediately started to bawl and asked her how the fuck she could possibly know any of it. I definitely said fuck. I was upset. "Brie, he's telling me." That first reading was one of the craziest experiences of my life, and that's saying a lot from a WWE wrestler. She asked me if I had been at the cemetery that morning putting flowers on his grave. She went on, "He said you were crying really, really hard, that you blame yourself." I told her that it was true. I had been there that morning, and I did feel responsible. She replied, "There was a reason for his death. I know it seems impossible, but there was a reason. You have to stop blaming yourself." Then she just let Bear speak. It was her voice, but it was his lingo. It was what he would say and how he would say it. When he was done, Trisha said, "He's rubbing your earlobes right now." "Is that a thing?" I gasped. Bear used to rub my earlobes all the time, whenever we were watching a movie or driving, or he just felt like reaching over and touching me. When his casket was going into the ground, his mom had reached over to rub my earlobes in his stead because I was so upset. Trisha ended up becoming a really important part of my life until I moved to San Diego. She was a different type of grief counselor, but one that I desperately needed. While these moments of reconnection and conversation with Bear didn't take away the pain of losing him, they helped me tremendously because I could feel him. I could hear the proof that he was still there, that he could hear me, that we were still deeply connected. I lost touch with Trisha over the years, though other mediums and healers have come in and out of my life as I've needed them. Judy, who owned the shop, was another pillar of strength, doling out a hug to anybody who needed one. All of my girlfriends started going there, just for hugs from Judy. Like me, they all came from families of divorce, families with shitty dads. She had the power to make you feel like the world was actually a really wonderful place, that all would be well. I was back in Scottsdale a couple of years ago and went by to see her after nearly a decade. As fate would have it, it was her last week in the store. She felt she was being called to move to the East Coast to open a store, that the people there needed her more. I had given her something of Bear's to put on the wall, and it was still there. When you're a kid, you think you'll live forever. Even adulthood, with kids and responsibilities, feels like it's decades away. When I lost Bear, I began to look at life differently. The day he died, he had skateboarded, gone to Jack in the Box with his friends, barbecued with his family. All in all, a beautiful and simple day that ended badly. I know that every day is a new day, and that I'm lucky to wake up and have it. I shouldn't take those small pleasures, like greasy fast food fries or a really fun night out with friends, for granted. I know that my only real concern should be living how it feels right and honest to live. It is never worth wasting energy on those who might judge or disagree with the choices that I've made. When I emerged from constant tears and heartbreak, I felt like a liberated spiritual being, free to love and live every moment. It is how you live when you feel like you've lost one of the things that is most valuable, when you realize that death might not necessarily be the end, and when you accept that we might just have a far greater purpose here. I'd shed all my tears for Bear. Nothing else could make me cry. Not my abysmal 2.7 GPA, not the way I'd lost my virginity, not anything going on at home or with soccer. Nothing sucks more than dying. I could do really badly on my SATs, which I did, but death is worse. Sure, my life wasn't perfect, but things could be so much worse. When I graduated, I had to get out of Phoenix because everything reminded me of Bear. I needed a fresh start, where I wouldn't be triggered by everywhere. My house, his house, the hole-in-the-wall Mexican joint off Camelback Road where he took me for burritos on one of our first official dates. He even drew something on the napkin for the waiter. If you've lost someone in a tragic way, when you are wholly unprepared for their passing, then you know that there is no forgetting. I'm sure that is true for those who have had long goodbyes and peaceful ends too. People are always scared to mention someone you've lost. I think they're afraid that maybe you've forgotten that that person is gone, and they're reminding you of something painful. But that's not how it actually is. The people you lose live in your mind, your heart, your very being, in a way that is constant. Talking about them feels good, even if it also might bring tears, because it's a way of bringing them to life again, of indulging in memories. There is no getting over it. There's only learning to live with it. The affirmation from Trisha also helped me learn how to trust my own gut and tap into my intuition. I know when I feel a certain internal pressure or shove that I should pay attention. It feels like Bear pushing me forward. In fact, I think it was Bear, knowing how much I love music and art and drama, who pushed me toward Los Angeles and WWE. Like most people, I was really only comfortable when I was good at something, when success was pretty certain. Blind leaps of faith were really fucking scary. When you have a lot of money, you can make mistakes and fall back into a safety net. I didn't have any dough for missteps, but the push was persistent. If someone had told me my senior year that I was going to become a WWE wrestler, I would have told them, no way. But I think Bear knew it was the right thing for me. It was Broadway, it was art, it was sport. When we were kids, guys used to call Nicole and me the Basham sisters, after the pro wrestlers Doug and Danny Basham. It was our personalities, our aggressiveness, the fact that Nicole and I both really liked to brawl. If Bear would have been in the stands watching us, he would have loved it. This funny, totally unlikely future in WWE. He would have loved it because I love it. After all, the only thing he really wanted from me was to stand up and fight for what I want. Who knows if my relationship with Bear would have even survived high school? Who knows where our lives would have gone? It is a weird thing to have a relationship that was never allowed to complete itself at such a young age, when you are keyed up to love with such abandon, when it feels so magical. There was no closure, no sabotage, no fighting until we hated each other. As we get older and wiser and a bit more seasoned, we make choices in relationships that transcend that beginning honeymoon phase. Everything is more measured, more sustainable. I'm so grateful that Brian is the man he is. He can hold all of me, even the parts that will always be a little broken. I'm free to be sad when I'm sad, without judgment, or feeling like I need to hide in the bathroom to cry. My residual grief is not an affront to him, or diminishing of all the wonderful people and things that I now have in my life. He understands that my heart is fully his, but that there's room in there to celebrate and remember Bear too. I like to think that Bear helped make me who I am. By loving me, Brian's love extends to Bear as well.
Chapter 4. My Other Big Break. 1993 to 2007. Phoenix, Arizona. Nicole. I kicked the soccer ball for the first time when I was in 5th grade. And when I say I kicked it, I mean I wailed on it. It had been my parents' idea to put me in club soccer. I was extremely athletic and very aggressive, which roughly translated to a sports for her decision. Though for my parents, athletics translated to free college and the promise that I would be too busy to become a drug addict or have an active dating life, so there was that too. In contrast, they put Brie in ballet. That was short-lived as they made her start playing soccer a year later, I think in part because I was so good at it. It seemed inevitable that she would be too. While Brie is also very athletic, she took soccer for what it was and ultimately quit in high school. It didn't really speak to her. I, on the other hand, wanted to go ham. I took that shit seriously. I played sweeper, which meant that beyond being a starter, the ultimate honor, I typically stayed on the field for the entire game. This was rare in 5th grade, when there was pressure to give all kids equal playing time and show no signs of favoritism. But I was a closer. I was good. Soccer was a big deal in Arizona, and our coaches were former professional players from Europe. It was a no bullshit, we're not just here to tool around and kill the afternoon approach to the game. Even in 5th grade, we were on that field to win. And I loved it. I wanted to be depended on in that way. I relished the faith and trust the coaches and other players put on me. We traveled as far as Washington, D.C. for tournaments, which meant that soccer could literally take me far away from home. The promise of a life that wasn't tethered to Arizona was very appealing at the time. It seemed like a real ticket out. I threw myself into soccer with so much abandon because not only was I good at it, and what kid doesn't love that type of affirmation, and very, very competitive, but also because it provided me with the structure, schedule, and boundaries that my parents weren't able to construct at home. My coaches were strict. Mandatory curfews, bedtimes, specific pre-game meal plans. I needed that sort of oversight from adults who were invested in my future, who cared about my well-being, who treasured me and thought I was really worth something. My parents needed it too because it created a way for them to really show up for me. My parents rarely missed games. My mom would run up and down the sidelines cheering us on. My parents loved us, but the scene at home was volatile at best. Soccer was anything but, as dependable and orderly as possible, controlled for all variables and factors. I was also very good at track. When I made it to regionals in 5th grade, I was the youngest competitive runner to break the track records in the 400 and the 800 in Arizona. I was super fast. I made it to regionals one year, which were held at UCLA. It was the first time I was away from Brie. I was there for a week, and so we would write each other letters. I think this was the first time that our paths ever diverged, that something separated us and put physical distance between us. I bombed my race. The girl who I really looked up to slipped and fell in the race before mine. It really shook me, and I couldn't get my head into my run. I pretty much jogged. It was the first time I had ever experienced being taken out of the game. I couldn't get back into it. Throughout high school, I spent my summers doing Olympic development programs. At that time, women did okay in the pro league. It seemed like a decent living if you could line up some endorsements. That was really the only path to the World Cup, which was, of course, the ultimate dream. But my first priority with kicking that ball was to use it to get my college education paid for. I wasn't a major student. As my sister and I say, we never learned how to talk good. But I knew I needed some sort of degree if I wanted to have a future. It all seemed within reach, too, because when I was in high school, I would get pulled up into Arizona State University scrimmages. My ultimate plan was to have soccer take me away from home. It's funny because those scrimmages were some of the first times that I encountered eye rolls as an upstart. I would head onto the field, and to be fair, I was cocky as shit. The older girls would just send hate rays my way. I didn't care at all. In fact, it just made me more driven, more competitive, more inclined to take the ball away from them. I didn't know it at the time, but it was a good training ground for WWE locker rooms, for moving through negative energy and that unbridled hope for my failure. On that field, I learned how to thrive in the toxic stew, to use it to my advantage. And I was aggressive, undeniably. I once got a red card, not my only one, because this girl took out Brie by yanking her down backwards by her shirt. If anyone was going to do that to her, it was going to be me. I screamed, "Don't touch my sister," and slammed that girl into the ground repeatedly. Obviously, a total overreaction, but people learn not to fuck with my sister. I got into a lot of fights and would yell at the coaches. I was a hothead and I felt like I had nothing to lose. During one game we were playing in Arcadia, the crowd in the stands started yelling, "Beaners, Beaners, go back to Mexico." So I slide tackled their star girl, looked at the crowd, and threw my hands up into the victory sign. They used to call me the Rock. I've always maintained that in order to do well at sports, you have to have a certain amount of confidence. Maybe cockiness, but fearlessness for sure. Since 5th grade, I'd always made All-State or been MVP. My senior year, I really wanted to be Player of the Year, which was a senior year only award. The rumor was that it was mine, even though a lot of the other coaches and players hated me. As I mentioned, I had a mouth on me. Then, a week before state, a week before that award might have been mine, a forward on the other team had a breakaway and I did a slide tackle, and she kicked me in the shin and broke my tibia in half. Out on that field that day, I couldn't move. My left side was in complete shock. My dad had to carry me to the sidelines. The firefighters came, though I assured them that nothing was broken. They played along with the charade, even though they knew just from looking at my leg that I was in serious trouble. My parents couldn't afford an ambulance, and so the firefighters carried me to my dad's pickup truck and he drove me to the hospital, where I sat in the waiting room for hours. By the time they brought me back, my leg was too swollen for surgery. The doctor wanted to operate, but felt it was too risky because of the swelling and potential for blood clots. They put me in a cast and sent me home for 2 weeks until my leg deflated. To get the cast on right, from hip to heel, they had to straighten my leg and flex my foot. Despite my incredibly high pain tolerance, I screamed bloody murder. I haven't experienced childbirth, but to this day, it was one of the most painful experiences of my life. And I've been flung from the ring into tables. When my parents divorced a few years prior, our insurance had changed. And not for the better. When I was 14, I had double knee surgery because there was no cartilage between my knee joint and my leg, patellofemoral syndrome, and I was able to have it done under the supervision of a really good surgeon. But this time, it was different. The first attempt to put a rod and 3 screws into my leg did not work, so they had to redo the surgery 3 weeks later. All of my college offers were rescinded since it wasn't clear I would ever be able to walk properly again, much less play competitive soccer. I can't really blame those coaches. I was stuck in bed. When I was up on my feet, I had to walk with a cane. My future as an athlete certainly wasn't assured. And then 2 weeks after I broke my leg, Bear died. The night that Bear died, my high school boyfriend, who we'll call Ken, had finally convinced me to get out of the house. I had been bedridden for 2 weeks, and getting up required a massive amount of energy. Plus, my entire future had collapsed, and I was pretty depressed. Ken was a football player and drove a green Camaro, of course, which was extra impossible to maneuver my leg into. We made it to the movie theater, and I was limping in on crutches when I felt a strong urge to go home to be with Brie and Bear. Ken was annoyed. It had taken a lot of effort to get me there, but I made him take me back. He understood what was happening at home, as he had come from a broken family too. Thank God I got the pull to leave. Thank God I hadn't been in a movie when she got that call. After Bear died, our home was a terrible scene. We had moved into a smaller house when my parents divorced, and Brie and I were sharing a room. At night, she cried inconsolably, her body just heaving in pain. I felt so far away from her, like I couldn't possibly reach her in her grief. I also couldn't lay any of my own sadness on her either. It didn't help that I was immobile. At night, I would army crawl and drag myself across the floor to get into bed with her and try to calm her down. We were just 2 girls in Arizona with collapsed dreams and uncertain futures. Brie, in particular, felt like everything she loved had been taken away. After Bear died, I had an appointment for my screws to come out. My mom was out of town, so she asked my dad to take me. He was really not in a good place, and we really weren't speaking. After, I was recovering at his house. He and Ken started fighting about something stupid. I think it was about who was getting more attention from me. They got into a yelling fight and then both took off. My dad to walk down the freeway, Ken in his green Camaro. They both just ditched me with nobody to even help me go to the bathroom. I think my dad was on mushrooms that day, though it was never easy to tell when he was using and when he was not. But drugs certainly fueled his rage. It was a weird time. The end cap to a pretty terrible 4-year run. It only underlined for me and Brie that we needed to get the hell out of Arizona. We needed a fresh start, far away. My grandparents had a little bit to give for college, but my parents weren't in any situation to pay for undergrad for 2 of us. I had always loved interior design and went to ASU to check out their program. I ultimately didn't feel like I could take out student loans and ever be certain I could pay them back. I just couldn't afford college. But I wanted out of Arizona. It was just too full of bad memories. I thought about going to cosmetology school since I was good at doing hair. I went to beauty school orientation, but it didn't appeal. As graduation approached, Brie and I decided to pack our bags and head to San Diego, to Grossmont Community College. Anything seemed better than home. Brie and I knew we could hustle for cash. We had both worked since we were 15. We'd been hostesses at Seafood Central, and I'd worked as a receptionist for my mom and at a local gym, The Village. We figured if we were responsible for ourselves, without the drama of home holding us back, it could only get better. We did a year at Grossmont and then went to Los Angeles. Then I ended up back in San Diego with my boyfriend, the professional snowboarder. I felt like I needed to make something of myself. Even though I was old for community college, 21 or 22, I showed up at the soccer field. Fortunately, the coach knew who I was from my high school career, and he insisted that I walk on. I demurred, but he told me to run a mile, right there. I was woefully out of shape, but he yelled, "Go, go, go," the entire time. I booked it until I almost passed out. He told me to make it to my classes, keep my grades up, and I joined the team. At that point, I felt a little awkward about my age. The other girls were always hitting me up to buy them beer. When the driver of one of the vans failed to show up for a tournament, I was the only player old enough to take the wheel of a rental car and drive instead. I played there for a year and took them to a state championship, earning MVP. This was despite the fact that I got a stress fracture in my right foot and had to learn how to kick with my left. The girls begged me to stay for another season. The coach thought I had a viable shot of making it as a professional player in Italy, but I was still with my professional snowboarding boyfriend. I knew that would be a total disaster if I moved to Europe. And by that point, Brie called me about the WWE audition. I watched the girls on Raw, and then drove up to LA to try out. Looking back on my senior year in high school, it's hard not to be angry. I pushed myself so hard to funnel all of my energy into soccer, and my education, social life, and SATs all suffered a lot for it. Then I ended up with a shitty-ass surgeon and the minimum requirement of physical therapy. We didn't have good insurance, which definitely didn't help. But my parents and I didn't advocate for me at all either. We didn't push enough on my behalf, demand better care, or research my surgeon before letting him fuck up my leg. Being a professional athlete now with resources, I realize how much more could have been done for me. How important it is to ask questions, research, explore all channels, and ask for help. I believe the outcome could have been so much better. Maybe that college scholarship could have been resurrected. I will say that my coach, Matt Potter, who had been with us since we started playing in 5th grade, did try to help. He knew how rough it was at home, and he treated us at times like we were his own kids. He would come and meet me outside of practice and get me training and moving again, kicking the ball, getting some mobility back. Throughout my life, and like Blanche Dubois, I've come to depend on the kindness of strangers. I was still young, with my whole life in front of me. But it's a strange experience when your best laid plans, everything you've ever counted on, disintegrate. And it's a stranger feeling when that future was contingent on your body, which you've always had complete control over. That period in my life was dark for many reasons, but it was really the first time that I felt like I personally hit a wall. I had lost the thing that most defined me. In retrospect, as angry as it made me, I wouldn't have had my life turn out any differently. Italy would have been fun and all, but women's wrestling and standing behind this movement of female empowerment in the ring, the creation of real-life sheroes, has inarguably been a much more incredible adventure to join and lead. And it feels like the fact that Brie and I were both rerouted on this path was anything but luck. After Bear died, Brie became very spiritual. Fortunately, a fair amount of that rubbed off on me. It came from watching her prevail over dark, dark grief, but also from her faith that there is something on the other side, that life has a much greater purpose than it might sometimes seem to have on the surface. I'm not saying that there was divine intervention in my leg break, but I do think that this bigger context, maybe we're not just here to live and die, helped me turn that course correction into something positive. I've always found that I'm most successful when I mix a certain amount of everything happens for a reason fatalism with driving really hard for what I want. It helps me manage my expectations for the moments when I don't get what I want, while also keeping me feeling like I am in the driver's seat and capable of and responsible for directing my life. So I wish I could say that I immediately went and capitalized on and maximized this post-soccer freedom, but not so fast. First, I had to marry and then divorce my high school boyfriend, Ken. Before I get into what he meant to me and why we eloped to a Las Vegas chapel, I need to back up to the darker undercurrent of high school. There were some experiences I wish I could forget, but I feel more than ever at this point in the culture like I need to revisit and share. My dad was controlling, abusive, and strict, and he had never really let me speak to boys. So when my parents finally divorced when I was 15, I lost my virginity. On the floor of a Hyatt hotel room on the 4th of July. Lost my virginity is very inaccurate, actually. My virginity was stolen from me, without my consent. I was raped by a guy I thought was a friend while I was passed out at a party. I'd had too many beers and maybe some shots of hard alcohol, and I only woke up because my stomach hurt. I came to, and this guy was both on top of me and inside of me. I pushed him off and ran out of the room. He followed me down the hall and asked me if this meant we were now boyfriend-girlfriend. It is fucked up, shocking in retrospect that it never occurred to me to call the police. I didn't even tell my sister because by admitting that it had happened, it became true. It became fact. He didn't apologize. He didn't worry about getting in trouble. He thought that by taking advantage of me, he should now have official and full access to me. That this attack would actually make me his, in a celebrated social way. I get enraged even talking about this now. I know I was not the only girl in our high school who was violated like that and then expected to shrug it off the next day. This is what it was like. There was no education around it, no awareness, no 5-point plan should it happen to you. And man, do I pray things are different now. That girls realize that if something that horrendous and sickening happens to them, they can and should say and do something. I wish I had known that I could have taken away his future the way he had taken something so sacred away from me. Something I was waiting to share with someone I loved at the time of my choice. While I didn't know what to do about it, I had even less of a clue how to address the shame and revolting feelings of ickiness that permeated my whole being. I had never even seen a penis, yet I was no longer a virgin. I actually had a boyfriend at the time, an older guy who went to another high school in town. He had been totally respectful of me, and we had never done anything beyond kissing. I didn't tell him that I had been raped, but I did tell him I was ready to have sex. I wanted so desperately to erase what had happened and replace it with a new first positive experience that felt special. He was surprised. When you're in high school, you typically follow the bases very slowly. I don't remember if he'd had sex before, but when we started, and he said, "You're not a virgin," I protested. But I was crushed. Side note, what a dick. The sex we had felt dirty and horrible. A few months later, I went to a modeling competition with a friend in California. We met two guys who invited us back to their hotel room. My friend was really excited about the invitation and begged me to go, even though they gave me the creeps. I tried to convince her that it was a bad idea. We were 16, they were college age, if not in their mid-20s, and it felt dangerous and wrong. But I finally relented. We sat on the edge of the bed while they tried to get us to drink from a jug of orange juice and vodka. I refused and refused again and again, until I finally relented. I thought that if I gave in on this, maybe they'd leave me alone. I hadn't drunk very much before I felt really dizzy and stood up to go to the bathroom, thinking I might vomit. One of the guys followed me in and bashed my head against the bathroom sink. I came to when he accidentally switched on the blow dryer with his elbow. I had clearly been roofied. I was groggy and I couldn't see straight, but I could see 4 condom wrappers littered across the bathroom floor, and realized that I had been raped. I hit him in the face and ran from the bathroom. My friend was gone and the door was open. I took off into the night, sprinting across empty fields until I made it back to the hotel where we were staying with her mom. My friend was there. She had left me behind and run. But she had also been raped and was hysterical and in the shower. Her mom held me until I calmed down. Then, for some reason, the 3 of us decided not to call the police. Not to tell anyone. We all decided to pretend like it had never happened. Even my mom is learning about this for the first time in this book. We certainly didn't do the right thing by failing to call the cops. But in a fucked up way, I think we all felt responsible. Her mom for failing to protect us. The 2 of us for willingly going to the guys' rooms, for drinking alcohol illegally. The Me Too movement both enthralls me with its potential and reminds me why rape and sexual assault are a double slap for women. There is the horrible offense in the moment, and then the shame and blame that follows and feel almost worse than the original pain. When something like this happens to you, you understand the blame the victim mentality. How easy it is to feel shame rather than anger. How easy it is to feel like you could have stopped it yourself. The if-onlys, the why didn't I's. I count myself lucky because I was unconscious for both rapes. But the other details, like the faces of all three men, the condom wrappers, the sound of the blow dryer, it's all seared into my mind. If I had been aware of what was happening to me in the moment, I would never have been able to escape it or get over it. I can imagine how the consciousness, the feelings of helplessness to stop the assaults could have really ruined my life. After these two incidents, I fell into a deep depression. When my mom was at work, I would go into her closet and shut the door and cry. I would just sit there, among a sea of her very work-appropriate 9 West heels. I gained visible weight. Probably the first time that I became the bigger sister of the two of us. It was a physical manifestation of holding on to all these secrets as a 16-year-old. I was eating my feelings in an attempt to push the depression down, to somehow digest it. I didn't want anyone to know what had happened. I didn't even tell Brie until many years later. I had no tools for processing the trauma, except to bury it deep within and pretend like neither episode had ever happened. I was just not equipped. Later that summer, I met the guy who would become my high school love. He held this promise of safety, of starting over. Ken and I first talked at a party. I was hanging out in a hot tub waiting for this hot senior I had a crush on to come back. Ken climbed in to keep me company. And then we really connected. I remember thinking that the water made his blue eyes sparkle. He was so handsome, and he had a lot of muscles for a high school kid. He seemed safe and protective. I totally forgot about the hot senior. Nothing happened that night with Ken, which made him seem even safer. He was not a guy who would rape a passed-out girl in a hotel room. After that night, we started talking on the phone and on AOL Messenger. My screen name was PNKDMND, which I picked because I thought Pink Diamond evoked Marilyn Monroe. I didn't know that it was a euphemism for a vagina. And it kind of fits me, don't you think? A few weeks later, Ken and I hooked up for the first time at a high school party. I was wearing platform Vans with a 4-inch lift, and I never took them off, even though I pretty much ditched the rest of my clothing. I was like a dude who wears his socks in bed. I must have been really into those Vans. We were hooking up in an empty bedroom, and then everyone at the party rushed in to bust us. From that point on, we were inseparable. We would hang out at school, after school, at night. He pretty much lived with us by our senior year. He also came from a broken home, and we remade our families in each other. I wanted to be his everything, and he wanted to be my everything too. We were bunny rabbits. Rabid bunnies, actually. Looking for anywhere and everywhere to have sex. The middle school baseball diamond, the football field, his Camaro. Ken was a hothead and was extremely protective. He even tried to fight a lecherous teacher who he thought looked at me inappropriately. I thrived on his desire to stick up for me at every opportunity. I so desperately wanted a guy to make me feel safe, to undo all the bad things that had happened to me. Ken made it feel like love means violent protection. Like the world is unsafe without a knight charging with a drawn sword. It squared with my childhood. It squared with what happened to me in my teens. He looked for fights. One time he got jumped by a group of kids. They came into the locker room after a game when he was alone and hit him across the back of the head with a bat before punching in his skull with brass knuckles. To this day, I don't know why they had him in their sights. But they had even created a website in advance to commemorate the day that Ken would die. Then they set out to fulfill their mission. They were all expelled. That wasn't his only rodeo in the hospital either. Another time, I think it was for a blood clot, he had to spend a few nights there. When his parents would leave, we'd have sex in his hospital bed. Just two kids thinking they were adults. We loved to see how sex would make his heart rate go up, because he was attached to all the machines. I want to die now thinking about it. Obviously, the nurses probably had to watch this entire hilarious spectacle from their station down the hall, while rolling their eyes. Although we'd both had sex before, our relationship was the first time that either of us had really experienced someone's body. I know I've always been a sexual person. I have the middle school journals to prove that. But I think I was partly so attached to Ken because I felt like I could find good touch with him. Enough good touch to take all those bad touches away. We were kind of lost and were each other's first love, defining what that meant as we went along. We fell hard. It was that first high school sweetheart love that's a dumpster fire of lust. In many ways, we were completely out of control. The sex, yes, but also the addiction to high drama. We thought that's what it was supposed to feel like. We often had terrible, even violent fights. We both knew that it wasn't healthy or sustainable. But we also quit the drama, or each other. We were like addicts.
Brie. Ken was a good guy, but the two of them together was not a good combination. He was jealous and controlling, and that was hard for me to see. They would fight all the time, including physically. I remember one time, Bear and I were hanging out at our house, and Nicole and Ken were there. I don't know how it escalated, but they started arguing in front of us. Then suddenly, they started wrestling, just throwing each other around my mom's living room. Bear intervened and tried to stop it. He was trying to push them apart when Nicole reached over and just ripped Ken's shirt off his body. Then Ken took off in his green Camaro. I remember thinking, can't we all just be normal for one single day?
Nicole. A week after graduation, Brie and I moved to California. We were so desperate to get away, to leave all of our bad memories in Arizona behind. The place was tainted, dark. It was a place from which we needed to escape. Ken decided to move to San Diego too. That's the point where our relationship really fell off a cliff. It was a messed up situation, because I wanted freedom and complete liberation from the past. Ken reminded me of everything that had happened that was bad. But he had also been my lifeboat for most of it. He would continue to be the person I clung to when things got bad, and I kind of resented him for it. Rinse and repeat. The fact that I didn't want to look back and didn't want to be tethered to the memories won out in the end. I just wanted to forget. So I treated Ken really poorly. We began a cycle of 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off that pretty much went like this. I would clamor for my freedom, and then something would happen that would make me feel bad or unsafe or in need of protection, and I would call him. When I felt safe once more, I would dump him again. We had gone through so much shit together, we could never fully let each other go. It makes me feel terrible to recount this because he didn't deserve any of it. Ultimately, he went to boot camp because he also wanted to change his life. And I wanted to move to Los Angeles. I missed him a lot while I was away, and I made that very known to him. Then someone planted it in our heads that if we were married, he wouldn't be sent abroad to serve. And so we drove to Vegas and got hitched. Internet research at the time was not my friend. I was in a sweatshirt, Uggs, my hair up in a messy bun. It was very Britney Spears. As I walked down the aisle, I thought, what the hell am I doing and how do I get out of this? We never lived together. I never took his last name. He ended up being shipped off to war despite our marriage certificate. That happened when we weren't actually together as a couple anymore and were dating other people, which I think I used as a justification for asking him for a divorce when he was away. I shouldn't have done that. I should have waited until he came home to ask him to let me go. I definitely owed him that, even though I ultimately knew that our attachment wasn't healthy, and our relationship wasn't good for either of us anymore. By the end, I hated the person I was with him. He made me crazy, evil almost, in a way that felt like I was possessed, like I wasn't myself. When you're young, I don't think you realize that there are other ways to end a relationship besides killing it. Instead, we went down a different path. A destructive, let's destroy ourselves as we destroy this romance journey that ultimately created so much more pain. It was on again, off again throughout, and I was typically the person driving the status. Every time I felt needy, I got him back. Then I would break up with him again. It was not kind. I was in complete sabotage mode. I think probably because deep down I thought it would be easier to drive him away than to choose to really leave and fully shut the door. I didn't know if I could hold that responsibility of ending the relationship, and I knew we would keep coming back together even though it was clearly not the right thing, unless we did so much damage that we burned the house completely down. It's not until you're older that you realize that there are much kinder ways to let things resolve. But, as I said, drama was our primary means of communication, and it always felt high stakes, high emotion. I saw him years later, at the funeral of a mutual friend. It was a devastating loss. One of those people who was beloved by many, the life of the party, the class clown, the person you can't imagine not being there anymore. He and Ken were like brothers, truly, in that they knew each other's secrets and had been there through tough times. But it was clear that Ken did not want to speak to me, and so I gave him space. There are very few people I have loved in my life, and Ken was one of them. I will always send him love. I always keep him in my prayers. I have daddy issues. I'm needy. I have to know someone is there who I can talk to and lean on. As much as I crave freedom, romantic and otherwise, I struggle to stay single. Fortunately, I don't feel like I remake all of the same mistakes from guy to guy. In retrospect, every one of them seems like it was a course correction on the last. I really believe that early, formative relationships do the lion's share of the work of showing you what you can and cannot tolerate in love, and what you ultimately value in a partner. I also believe that when you're young, one of the lines you have to watch is that of codependency. In the process of giving yourself wholly over to a relationship, you have to learn how to find where you end and someone else begins. While Ken was more dependent on me by the end, I got to really sample the other side of the equation next. Enter Jake. I met Jake when Brie and I had been hired to dress up as naughty nurses for a magazine shoot with him. He was really, really late. Rudely, horribly late. When he finally decided to grace us with his presence, he walked in, looked at me, and said, "My dream girl." My reaction? Ew, what? I was 19 and he was 29. I told him we'd only hang out with him if he went and bought us beer. He was a big deal Mexican pro athlete who used to wear these sports jerseys. He was exactly my type. Tough, gangsterish, built. He was also exceptionally charming and funny and really sweet. I thought he was definitely going to be the love of my life. While he had many wonderful qualities, Jake was also jealous and possessive. We both were in our own ways. I was still at that point in life where I thought love should be dramatic and all-consuming. To be fair, I hadn't seen a real model of something more sustainable growing up. I assumed it was perfectly normal to both hate and love someone within the span of 20 minutes, to fight aggressively and then want to make up and have sex minutes later. The fact that Jake was 10 years older than me makes a lot of sense when I look back. To this day, I struggle with my desperate desire for a father figure. Someone to tell me what to do, put a fence around me in some ways, be my protector. He did and was all of those things. I completely put my own life on the back burner. This was convenient in many ways because I didn't really know what I wanted my life to be, and his life was pretty great. So I followed him around for 2.5 years, to Alaska, to the X Games, to wherever he determined we should go next. I really just checked out, which flipped Brie out. Rightly, she pointed out that I was living for Jake. I had stopped doing things with my friends, and I had given up on my own life goals. I think that it's moments like these that can fully derail women. It's hard to get it going in your early 20s, as every step feels momentous. You have no traction or experience under your belt, and you don't have a network of people who can guide you or help you to your next big break. I've watched friends, even with fancy degrees from 4-year colleges, just kind of blow it. They didn't push aggressively against those moments of not knowing what the fuck to do with their lives. It seems that if you leave it to life to figure it out for you, it won't always turn out for the best. I remember going to a Blockbuster, rest in peace, with Jake to rent a movie. We walked past the WWE pay-per-view section. Not surprisingly, he was furious about my WWE contract. In fact, I'm kind of surprised I actually carried through with the audition, knowing he would not be supportive. He was mad because it would take me to Tampa instead of to Salt Lake City, where he primarily lived. Plus, he was really uncomfortable with the prospect of the guys. Honestly, that was the last thing on my mind. When it's your job, you're not really checking out the dudes in their tights and trunks. Though, admittedly, there were a lot of backstage shenanigans at that point in WWE history. He came to visit me once, saw the dudes, and just lost it. I think Jake's jealousy was probably more of a function of his own struggles with fidelity. He often told me that if we stayed together, he'd probably cheat on me. It was a messed up thing to say, but I appreciated his honesty. Also, I've learned along the way that if someone is jealous in a way that doesn't seem deserved at all, it's probably because they themselves shouldn't be trusted. We had been together for 2.5 years, and I thought we would be together forever. But our relationship unraveled in a few short months. I knew I'd found my true calling in the wrestling ring in Florida, but it was still really hard on me to let that relationship go. I was so wrapped up in him and wanted to please him so desperately that I was crushed when he broke up with me. We had a deep connection, particularly in the bedroom. We had been inseparable until wrestling came between us. The jealousy was exhausting and unsustainable, but it still didn't feel like ending it was my choice. Obviously, the end of our relationship was the right thing. It was definitely the right thing for my time at FCW, where Brie and I were training in developmental. Wrestling is consuming. It's a strange, insular world, and it's best pursued when you can keep your head fully in the ring, without distractions from loved ones who are far away. So even though I was depressed, devastated really, that Jake had broken up with me, it was way better for my career. I could be fully physically present. It also established wrestling as the other lover, the thing I wanted more than the love of my life. With everything that I had sacrificed, there was no way I was backing down from making it to the main roster, even if I had to fight a lot of girls to get there. In making it as a professional athlete, I was also able to reconnect with the primary positive identity of my childhood. I took a hold of that athlete plotline again, and going back to that, reclaiming that title, allowed me to vanquish some of the darker memories from Arizona too. I acknowledged that I could be the athletic star I remembered without carrying my victimhood into the future. I was a warrior. I was a superhero. And most important, I had learned how to use my body to fight back.
Chapter 5.
All right, that is the conclusion of part 1. We're going to stop it right here. This is Incomparable, written by Brie Bella, Nikki Bella Audiobook. We are here at the Red Carpet Ring and Pink Square Circle. So we are talking about Incomparable by Brie Bella and Nikki Bella. We talked about the early lives of Brie and Nikki. Now there will be a part 2 here. I will put that out simulcast again. But stay tuned. I will have that out. Keep your notification bell on for Pink Square Circle and Red Carpet Ring. Greatly appreciate it. Soon to videos will pop up. You guys click the links below. Till then, guys, I will see you later. It is OUT.
Like I say this a lot, we're not a sport. We're a movie about a sport, or a TV show about a sport, right? So the interest of all the other...
I feel like the heel turn did wonders for me. There was a sense of reality in that, to where I had hit a point, and the babyface stuff was going great. The Alpha Academy stuff was going great. We had a blast with that. But I'm a realist, and I'm also like a long-term thinker.